Whenever you're ready. Sorry for the late start. Good morning, all. Thank you for joining us this morning. I think I can see you from here. This room is not as cozy as the other one, so sorry we're so far away from you. I'm Felicia Marcus, Chair of the Board. Today's Tuesday, May 3rd, unbelievably, and the meeting's called to order. With me, to my left, Vice Chair Fran Spivey-Weber. To her left, Board Member Didi Diadamo. To my right, Board Member Tam Dodak. And to her right, Board Member Stephen Moore. Mr. Howard, will you please introduce the staff that are assisting today?
Yes, to my right, Chief Counsel Michael Laufer. To my left, Eric Oppenheimer, Chief Deputy. John Bishop is on vacation today. And assisting the board are Janine Townsend and Courtney Tyler.
Great, thanks very much. Emergency evacuation procedure, I think everybody or virtually everybody in the room knows, but I have to say, and for those of you who haven't been with us in the last couple of weeks, there is actually a change, which is the news flash. If you do hear an emergency sound, well, look now for the exit nearest you. You hear the emergency sound, pick up your stuff and your friends and proceed safely out of the building. We used to gather in Cesar Chavez Park. Now we gather at J. Neely Johnson Park, which is down 11th Street between E and F Street. And so come with us over there if you want to know when the all clear to come back in has happened. Also, the meeting's being webcast and recorded, and so that means when you come up to the microphone, please get close enough to it that we're sure it picks up so that the folks over the, just like I just didn't do, so that folks can hear over the webcast, but not so close that it pops. Also, just out of courtesy, take all your noisemakers and set them on stun or silent or turn them off. And with that, we're on to the public forum, which is when anyone wishing to speak on an item that is not on the agenda can speak. To speak on that or any of our agenda items, fill out a blue card and hand it to Ms. Townsend. Where are the blue cards? They're in the back. There's a table back there. Okay, great. All right. Well, with that, we'll move right into the minutes from April 19th and 20th. And there's a change that we have made to it. So,
Move adoption of the minutes.
Second.
okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, minutes are approved. Next, Mr. Howard, item number 2.
Yes, item number 2 is from the Division of Financial Assistance. It's a resolution authorizing the Deputy Director to provide drinking water state revolving fund loan and Proposition 1 funding to the City of Kerman in the amount of $3,230,000. And Julie Rosardo is presenting, and she'll introduce the staff.
Pull Kerman up.
Good morning, Chair Marcus
Morning.
and members of the board. Julie
Hello.
Rosardo with the Division of Financial Assistance. I also have with me today Joel Greathouse and Pete Stamus of the division and Zach Miller with the Office of Chief Counsel. Item 2 on your agenda today would authorize up to $3,230,000 in drinking water grant financing for the City of Kerman to consolidate Double L Mobile Ranch Park with a condition that allows the Deputy Director of the division to increase the amount by 15% for good cause. Double L was issued a compliance order on August 1st, 2011 for violation of the uranium maximum contaminant. Double L is a severely disadvantaged small community water system located in the San Joaquin Valley with 37 service connections and an MHI of 14,000. The residents are primarily farm workers, many of which cannot afford to buy bottled water. The project is coming to the board because it exceeds the $25,000 limit per service connection set in the drinking water intended use plan. The proposed project would cost $87,297 per connection. The City of Kerman is a disadvantaged community water system serving over 3,600 connections. The proposed project would connect Double L to the city's water system, which currently serves over 3,600 connections. To connect Double L to the system will require 3.5 miles of pipeline, construction of a new well, booster pump, and associated appurtenances. These facilities will also provide the City of Kerman some water supply options as they deal with 8 existing wells that have hexavalent chromium issues. The current city water rates are affordable for disadvantaged communities. However, the cost for Double L to remain their own water system and treat for uranium on site is at least 5 times the cost to consolidate. Consolidation with the city has been deemed the only long-term sustainable solution for Double L after extensive evaluation of alternatives. The city is willingly entering into the consolidation and in fact have spent several years and much of their own staff time completing planning and design work and applying for funding on behalf of Double L. The city will be taking on the operation and maintenance of the new facilities, and the Double L water system will no longer be a permitted public water system. Construction of the project will be conditioned on approval of deliverables, including final plans and specifications. Division staff will also work with the City of Kerman to evaluate the potential for additional cost savings by using solar energy to power the distribution system's pumps. We are happy to answer any questions you may have.
Questions?
I think this is a lot of work's gone into this, and I appreciate staff's work and the local agencies and community. Can you comment on sort of the scale of similar situations, either in that area or statewide, as far as instances where the $25,000 connection per connection may be exceeded? You know, what is the potential workload ahead of us?
Okay, so in a few months here, we're bringing the intended use plan before you for consideration, and that's for the drinking water intended use plan specifically. On that intended use plan, currently we have 23 projects that are listed on there that are less than 200 service connections that we could potentially fund in the next fiscal year. Of those, 7 currently exceed the $25,000 service connection limit.
How many again?
7 out of 23. And those are our pending applications. So that gives you an idea of what has already been submitted in terms of applications that could potentially move forward in the next year. That is within those very small systems.
And a similar circumstance of a consolidation or an attachment to an adjacent system, or just may be, you know, a well development for a public water system that remains independent?
Those 7 actually are either consolidations and or for schools.
The resolution included an authorization for the deputy director to increase the agreement amount for up to 15% for good cause. What is a good cause?
So that's in there just in case there's, in case the costs go up from the amount that we approve. If we approve the amount that we were given, the estimated budget from 5-6 months ago, if there's a cost increase, we wanted to avoid having to come back in here. So if the bids come back in higher, that's what that percentage would be requested for. And also, Stephen, you asked about the cost. The cost for drilling this well and the pipeline cost are very typical costs for these types of projects. The difference here is we just have a very small community that we're connecting.
Question about rates and affordability. This project would be cheaper than dealing with it on site. It would be 5 times as much. Can you give a little information on what the cost would be per resident under this plan versus another plan, and what are they paying right now, and what are they doing right now? You know, are they trucking in water? Are they?
So currently, in the mobile home park, the rate is just included in the rent that they pay. There's a master meter that's going to be installed at the front of the property, so it's going to be the responsibility of the business owner there to pay the water bill to the City of Kerman. The city water rates are around $30 base rate, and estimates to treat for uranium could cost as much as $50,000 plus per year for that for those residents, and you spread that out, and you're well above $100 a month for their water rates.
Okay, great. And is the base rate expected to go up as a result of the project?
No, the city rates are not, but with them facing all of their wells being out of compliance with hex chrome, I imagine in the coming years, evaluating drilling new sources, they'll probably have to adjust those rates depending on what kind of financing they get. And they've already started approaching our agency for funding that project as well.
And I'm going to support certainly this request. However, I do anticipate that, with the small communities, but also Kerman and other larger, but still not, still groundwater dependent communities that have various and sundry problems, is going to be a growing need, and we simply don't have enough money to buy our way out of this challenge. And we don't really know how big the problem is. We have an idea that it's big, but we don't really know exactly where, when, and how. And I suspect we have not engaged other agencies who may be able to help with some of this. And so my request is that, actually I'm glad Eric is in the room. My request is that we meet with Ken Alex and OPR, because they are coming out with the new guidelines for the general plan, and the Sustainability Council, who do a lot of mapping of and planning associated with transportation and land use. We need a map of where these water quality problems are likely to, are already exist or are likely to exist in the future, particularly with Sigma coming on board. It's just, there's just a lot of stuff happening, and we need to get in front of it with, I think it's not our problem exclusively, but we are a component of addressing the problem in the future. So I'm not sure, Eric, since Eric's here, he's taking notes. But I do think we need to be meeting pretty quickly with other parts of state government to see what resources there are that are out there to get at least a better picture of what we're facing over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I think you've done some of that, but I would add we should probably pull in Debbie Franco and also USDA Rural. They have a lot of money in this arena too.
Yeah, and we are certainly working with those partners, especially with the much larger dollar value project with the hex chrome and the 8 wells that they're looking at. And so we do regularly partner also with California Rural Water Association. They have been instrumental in this project, going out, doing outreach for years and years to make this all happen, and offering support as well in terms of preparing the application materials. So we do expect as well to use those Proposition 1 technical assistance resources to help along to make sure that construction planning is one thing. Construction projects are a much larger effort to coordinate. I do see that we'll need some community outreach as far as when this project is getting ready to be constructed. We'll need to definitely utilize our bilingual resources there too as well.
Other questions, comments, motion?
Well, I'd like to move adoption of item 2.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Next, we have item number 3, which is an informational item on the drought. Our regular updates. So we're going to have more of those 5-minute thunderstorms this week? That's interesting. 5-minute thunderstorm with hail. That was weird. Helped a little bit. So we'll take every drop.
Good morning, Chair Marcus, Vice Chair Spivey Weber, and board members. My name is Rich Sitkowski, and I'm an engineer with the Division of Water Rights. And we'll be talking a little bit about the drought conditions in California. With me is Diane Riddle, Program Manager for the Bay Delta and Hearings section. First of all, and during April, we did receive a few additional storms, the 5-minute storms, as you say. So it brought in some precipitation, but overall, season to date, the Sac Basin has received about 109% of average precipitation. The San Joaquin is at 95% of average precipitation, and the Tulare Lake Basin is at 86%. In the Sac River Basin, the major reservoirs are still doing well. As of April 28th, Shasta Reservoir is 108% of historical average for this time of year. Oroville is at 118%, and Folsom is 114%. Shasta, Oroville, and Folsom all made flood control releases at some point this current year. In the San Joaquin River Basin, the water picture is not as rosy, but it's up from April. New Melones is at 41% of historical average, which is the same as last month. New Don Pedro on the Tuolumne is at 92%. That's up from 83%, but this time last month. And next checker is 78%, up from 60%. Millerton, however, is at 80% of historical average. That's down from 93% at this time about 30 days ago. As far as project operations, with the March storms boosting reservoir levels, DFR increased its allocation on April 21st to 60% of its requests. That's up from 45% on March 17th, so that's good news. On the CVP side, as far as the April forecasts go, north of Delta, in Delta, and wildlife refuges are all at 100% of contracted supply. Bryant contractors are at 50% of supply as of April 21st. That's actually up from 40% as of April 11th. And south of Delta, agriculture and M&I are the same as last month. Agriculture is at 5% of supply, and M&I is at 55%. The next item is the drought contingency plan and temperature management plan. On April 22nd, we did receive from the two water projects the April update of the drought contingency plan. Also on April 6th and going on to the temperature management plan, Reclamation did hold a temperature planning meeting with many stakeholders, including the Sacramento River settlement contractors, the Santa Clara Valley Water District, Contra Costa Water District, Placer County Water Agency, Seawind was there, the Pacific Coast Federation was there, DWR, and State Water Board staff. On April 28th, which is just the other day, Reclamation submitted its temperature management plan, and in there, however, some of the temperature targets and Shasta releases at the end of September carryover storage is somewhat different than what NIMS had approved in the recent April letter. And NIMS, we just heard, I think it was yesterday, that NIMS has some concerns over the differences between the two, between what NIMS had approved and what the Reclamation had run and went through its model. If there are questions, Ron Milligan from the Bureau is here to answer those questions regarding the differences. This afternoon, Reclamation will conduct the first 2016 meeting of the updated, revised Sacramento River Temperature Task Group. And the task group has been restructured to focus solely on technical matters. And as part of that, the membership has been expanded to include the Sacramento River Temperature Contractors, settlement contractors. So there'll be more input from those folks. The group is planning on meeting once per month, but more often if needed. And the reclamation as part of this is also recommended that there be a new Sacramento River Temperature Agencies group, as they call it, representing the 5 agencies, the Reclamation, NIMS, California Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and the State Board. And then they would just meet as needed to address issues requiring resolution, and would report to the Water Operations Management Team and the RT-DOT group.
So I'm sure people who don't already know all of that found that a mouthful, but yeah.
It is quite a bit. A lot of things have happened as of
But
late.
you didn't use acronyms, which I think was helpful.
I try not to.
That was good.
I did say RT-DOT, so.
Yeah, I guess so.
And then lastly, on April 1st, Reclamation submitted, as you know, a temporary urgency change petition, a TUCP. And on April 5th, the board held a workshop on the temporary urgency change petition. In the afterwards, the board's executive director issued an order approving most of the changes requested by Reclamation for the New Melones project. Just a few of the things that were included: there was a modified San Joaquin River spring pulse flow requirement of about 3,000 CFS at Vernalis, and specifically requiring compliance with NIMS's biological opinion flow requirements, and a provision of 75,000 acre-feet of additional flow from the San Joaquin River during the pulse flow period. Also included was a modified spring base flow requirement following the pulse flow period through May 31st of 1,000 cubic feet per second. There's also a modified spring base flow requirement during June of 500 cubic feet per second. Also included, which is something that is interesting, is a requirement that Reclamation prepare and submit a proposal to address its compliance issues until the San Joaquin River flow objectives are updated and implemented through phase 2 of the Bay Delta plan process. There's also a requirement for 415,000 acre-feet of carryover storage in New Melones at the end of September, and this is to ensure that the storage is maintained for water quality and fisheries protection going into the next water year. There's a requirement that Reclamation meet the Stanislaus River dissolved oxygen requirement, and an October San Joaquin River pulse flow requirement, as well as any NIMS biological opinion requirements this year. And then finally, there's a requirement that Reclamation submit a water accounting on a daily basis to the State Water Board. Well, let me back up and say it's a water accounting methodology to the State Water Board, and this will be done on a daily basis for New Melones Reservoir. And as part of that, there's a requirement that the Reclamation provide the State Water Board with its assumptions and a legal basis for any of those assumptions during its water accounting methodology process. So with that, I'll stop there, and we can answer any questions.
Again, with that last condition, that's to help us better understand how much water in New Melones Reservoir is taken under the Bureau's water rights versus other water right holders.
Well, I personally am curious to hear about the difference between NIMS and
Yeah, I think we can invite Ron Milligan up to remark on that.
Have a chair.
Where would you like me to sit?
It's up to you. Why don't you have a seat? I know, that's pretty impressive, really.
Good morning.
Morning.
It's once a month is just not enough to come and talk about all that's going on. Um, so Rich and Diane covered a couple different things, and I thought I'd at least talk about updates on the Sac River, and then if I can, if time permits, talk a little bit about how things are progressing on the San Joaquin with the pulse flow and
Great.
in the order as well.
Can I ask you a little hydrology question first? I know we're going to see it in a slide for the conservation report, but the numbers for precipitation are pretty good in the Sac Valley, but the snowpack numbers for now changed, I won't say alarmingly, because maybe it's normal because it's been warm, but remember we were at 109% and now on average, or 100, a little under 100% overall, and now we're at 62 for this time of year. Does that affect your, well, you're giving such a
So-
low allocation to your juniors that,
Yeah, I think this is my take on that, and we've been kind of watching this to try to figure out that tracking. It appears, and this is what we were somewhat concerned about in April, because April was difficult in the sense of you had some good inflows to the reservoirs. The question was that the product of some of your March runoff and that rain events we had early, or was that a combination of some of your snow melt coming a little bit early? So I think what we've seen now as you get into through May is that what you had the same kind of snowpack, but I think it came a little faster. So you're probably sitting a little better in your reservoirs like Oroville, Woolwich Bar, Folsom, probably going down a little bit further into the McCollum system. That basically you've got that ahead of time, so it's not necessarily alarming in the sense, I think once you do the accounting all the way through July, you'll probably end up about the right place. But those numbers do indicate that it was a little more front-loaded in terms of the snow melt component. Interesting, though, that puts you at a fairly high state in your storage, and the weather forecast for this week is kind of interesting in that there's not a very strong system coming through, but in some of the basins we have a couple inches up in the higher foothills into the mountains, which in a basin like the Yuba or maybe the American could make some interesting runoff into there if that mixes a little bit more.
Right.
Well, obviously, we may get to a point where, we may need, it's not so much as the controlled situation we've got right now. So I think that'll be interesting. The other part that's been a little bit interesting mix, given how we've been handling, kind of presenting to the board in the sense of a 90% forecast and a 50% forecast. What's interesting is when they kind of cross over. So our March conditions with the really heavy rain in the first part of March and the runoff that's associated with that has set us up for April, we had some fairly high outflow requirements, but there was excess conditions in the rivers, and that was pushing out pretty nicely. So, and I'll have a little graphic that kind of helps define that. As we transition now into end April into May, we have quite a few days of probably requiring Chips Island based on the criteria. But now we're getting to the point where we're hitting, because it has been somewhat dry from mid-March now through April, the rivers, creeks are starting to dry up a little bit, and you're starting to see agriculture kind of come online. So we've got the lower flows in the creeks that are probably more defined by the 6 weeks of dry weather, and you've got some outflow requirements that are probably influenced by the 1st of March. So we're going to have to, the projects are going to have to augment some releases here to be able to meet those outflow requirements. So we're just the other day crossed outflow index of about 11,000, and that's what we're probably going to need at some point as salinity for X2 starts to creep higher and higher, and by next week we may need to be actually meeting the X2 requirement with outflow. And if we're at roughly 25 days of Chips Island, we're going to have to then backfill with some releases upstream. And I think that kind of leads to some of the discussion on the SAC temperature component as we get into this little bit drier configuration, how do we match that up, and concerns about, gee, we want to do the absolute best temperature-wise for Sac River. And I think the differences between what we had in the, well, I'll call it the late March version of things, or snapshot, versus the late April, has been the 90% exceedance, less inflow. Obviously, the March 1st stuff was kind of driving that pretty well. So if you take this from the context of, maybe didn't see it so much in the end of April number, 4.2 to 4.3 was still about right, but the May inflow, I think we're seeing this with some of these snowpack numbers, is probably going to be a little bit less. And by the time we get to end of September, as opposed to being at 3 million, we're about 2.8 million. So a couple 100,000 acre feet difference on the inflows. But also with a little drier Sac Valley, probably, and this is the juggling act with the state water project, as to what's going to be the need from Shasta in a July timeframe to meet salinity control and just the balancing within the system, and not necessarily rippling too much into the Folsom and Oroville components. So the one element that is different is that we've kind of put forth, and I'm looking at this as a work in progress, because we want to definitely run through this with some of the newer models for survivorship that NOAA Fisheries has been working on, which are very interesting. Once you kind of are able to decipher what they mean, because graphically there's a lot of information packed in. That both from a temperature component as well as a flow stability question is it possible to push a little more water out in July and keep the system balanced? Or is that going to be a number that we want to keep very stable and figure out what our contingency plan is with the other reservoirs to match that? And they have some temperature elements associated with that. Also, we're trying to get to 65 degrees at Watt Avenue for the summer in terms of steelhead. So that's brewing as well, and that can be disrupted somewhat with the July releases. So July is where the system is at its most stretched, and balancing that's interesting. The other part is, looked to us that in the components of what we saw with April as we went through the iterative process, because now we're, which I think is a good thing, but it's also a back and forth, is Reclamation taking a cut at this with the system-wide flow releases, temperature regime, then taking that and handing off to NOAA Fisheries and have them turn into some of these products, and then coming back and assessing how all that means. So maybe if I go through one slide. So what we submitted to the board as part of, and I'll call it just an interim package, and this is probably the first step here, is a set of releases and temperatures using our 90% hydrology and a warm set of conditions for stratification of the lake and warming through Keswick, and then on downstream. And this is the blue line, which is squiggling near the 52-degree mark, is a little bit warmer than what we showed in the documents that we sent the month before. And that is, gee, that seems like that's a warmer set of numbers. But we did that by design. It's kind of on average about a half a degree warmer, because we wanted to see what this meant in terms of the mortality modeling. The green line kind of represents a temperature downstream, daily average, and the 56-degree line is there, which is, in this case, Jelly's Ferry, which would have been in the context of 90-5 type of thinking would be a year coming, kind of generic year in the past, coming into this, we probably say, gee, I think this year we're going to try to meet and target and manage to 56 degrees at Gillies Ferry. Now, it's a little warm on the front end and gets a little cooler on the back end. And
That's so that it's cooler when the reds are there and the,
well, if this was, I'll say 6, 7 years ago, we would say, gee, this needs a little more work to kind of balance that up. But that would have been a little colder on the front end, a little warmer on the back to balance that. Because instead of looking at the 52 at Keswick, you would have been looking downstream. But that's not how the approach we're going to take this year. It's different. We want to be much more focused at the place where the reds are in place. So this is trying to stay much more focused around a number across that whole line at around 52 degrees. Now, 52 degrees seems, to everyone's understanding, pretty much a slam dunk. You won't have any temperature-related mortality. And we're seeing that that's going to be interesting at the latter part of the season because everyone is also concerned about when do you go to full side gates and how that would work. So we're taking as our first iteration here through the temperature test group in no fisheries a slightly higher temperature to see what that means. This next, well, and I'll just go back, at the very top box is probably some small print, but the differences in flows that are probably of interest is for this iteration, we added another 1,000 CFS of flow in July just to be able to balance. What we're seeing is some concerns for the latter part of the basin. And this is a product of from March, end of March going into April, kind of the drying out of the basin, that some of the reservoirs are going to have to kick in a little more water probably in the July timeframe. So we wanted to see what that meant in terms of temperatures.
And that's to respond to what you were saying earlier about outflow?
It's both an outflow and the fact that there's probably, or at least perceived now to be a little less natural creek flows that are going to be existing in July. The estimates on that piece of all this kind of contribution downstream of the reservoirs is a little bit less now. And the reservoirs collectively are probably going to have to add a little more flow in to balance the operations and the outflow requirements. And in our conversations with Fish and Wildlife Service, this is going to be a really critical year that we don't cut corners on the outflows, whether it's X2 in the spring or through the summer. So this is an attempt to say, gee, what if we needed to put an extra 1,000 in just from a temperature standpoint, recognizing that the timing of the spawning is also going to be a concern, and a lot of the focus on this July to August into September is going to be when did the spawning happen, where in terms of the potential for dewatering, because dewatering is a concern as well, and we understand that, but that's not something any of us know. If spawning occurs kind of on the more historic pattern, that's probably not a problem here. But if it's later by 3 weeks, then you have the potential that some of the late spawners that may come up and spawn at 11,005 become potentially dewatered by the time you get to September. And those are the things that we need to balance. But the difficulty is, do you do some, so there's two different pieces there. From a temperature standpoint, do you want to try to put a little more outflow, see what you can do temperature-wise, recognizing you may not be able to go all that way? And you at least want to know temperature-wise, will it work? And then see if it works with the flow. And then if it can't work with the flows, then how can you juggle with, let's say, Oroville Folsom Ops? Now, maybe for the audience, and hoping on your screens that this is a little bit easier to read. And when Eric Danner with NOAA Fisheries Science Center was here, 6 weeks ago, he had this graphic up, and at the time I said, boy, there's a lot of information there, and it takes a little time to digest. But what this represents is that profile of temperatures and releases that I just showed you, predominantly taking the data stream from Keswick release, taking that into one of their tools that looks at then the temperatures of the air temperatures applied to those flows, and how that progresses downstream, and then thinking about that in terms of where the reds, both in terms of location spawn and timing spawn. So the black circles represents kind of the collective red locations and point in time over the last 3 years. So that's just kind of illustrate. So the y-axis here is basically distance from Keswick Dam. So as you can see, most all of these reds are within the first 10 miles, and most of them even higher than that in terms of downstream of Keswick. You'll see one in this whole time frame that was about 30 miles downstream in kind of a May setup down there in that red area. But most all the rest of them are up higher in the system. Now what this is this is although it's kind of a graphic that might lead you to think it's related to temperature, it's actually related to estimated survivorship related to temperatures, temperature survivorship. So if a red forms at those locations at those times and it's a dark blue, you're going to have very high success rate in terms of survivorship. If you spawn in an area that's red, then you're probably not going to get a lot of survivorship there. And right now, and there's a little bit on the upper curve related to like a 90% envelope. And so this is kind of one snapshot of saying, gee, with this information, you're at least 90% going to have success for survivorship, kind of going up to 100. And then collectively, depending on the tools, you're going to get to 95 to 100% survivorship with the flow temperature regimes that we had in that 90%. The next box down is if you kind of use what we've been looking at for our latest snapshot for 50%. We kind of were interested
real
in how
quickly,
this,
so just to clarify, that this is for the winter run Chinook only, the reds.
Correct.
And then also, this is based on data from your model for this year, for the
Yes.
exceedance probability.
yes,
Right. Thanks.
well, let me put it this way, the rainbow area is the product of this year's information, but the black dots are from the last 3 years to give you an idea of the spatial and timing distribution.
This is based on the flow proposal from the previous plan, correct?
No, this is from the one that,
You submitted
yeah,
on the 28th.
this is somewhat hot off the presses because we were interested as to what this looked like. We are going to go and do a couple more variations of what we provided to you from the graphic earlier, moving around the temperatures early in the season. There is some thinking that just having digested some of this data within the biological community, that the front-loaded cooler temperatures give you better results ultimately. And, well, maybe for me, for more of a layman in the biology arena, that seems a little counterintuitive to me,
Yeah, it does.
but the logic is that although you may have fewer reds on the front end, if it's colder and they're successful and they have some cooler water, they can tolerate just a little warmer water later. They grow bigger. And later in the season, to be able to get past Red Bluff, bigger is better. Late spawners, even though it may be cooler, are smaller and just don't
Oh, I
have the
get it
same
now.
success
Okay.
rate downstream. So that's an interesting dynamic. We're still tinkering with this. It's something I think we're going to talk more about at the temperature test group today. It's kind of our first meeting. We kind of asked that the first meeting be an in-person one.
Good.
Because although the folks that typically participate are fairly spread out up and down the valley, some all the way up into the Trinity Basin, we did have some back and forth. We really wanted to have as many of these in person because I do want to foster more of a back and forth discussion about some of these things, particularly as we're using new metrics, I'll call them. Certainly, like I said in the first graph, 56 degrees average temperature far downstream is probably not the best way to do this mousetrap. We want to be a little bit different. We want to think about this 7-day daily max average type of metric. The literature would suggest that may be a more appropriate thing to look at. Operating to that may be an entirely different thing, and we're not sure, but we've never done it. So this would be an interesting season for that, and we want to particularly walk through it as to, okay, how are we going to deal with that? Because we don't want inefficiencies of chasing our tail with
Well, and you don't want to
temperatures.
do an experiment after 2 years of
We definitely
collective-
don't want to do that. So this is why we're really trying to hit the temperatures as best we can here.
What, can you, if you're comfortable with it, I saw something come in from Noah this morning, but wasn't able to read it before we got here. What is the issue between you all and
Well, I don't know
NIMS
if
at the
there's,
moment? And what's our timeline on when it needs to be kind of nailed down?
well, I think that, I don't know if I would call it an issue. I do think
Okay.
we're trying to, make sure that when we communicate all this information, that we get a chance to be on the same page and understand that. The real question is, given this, I think what I'm kind of presenting to you and want to talk through is using a lot of these tools and think about how are we going to characterize our temperatures going forward. I think North Fisheries would like to at least say, at this particular point, they've agreed to X, which is try to stay at 52 degrees at Keswick, and we would like to see this 7-day max 55 degree number at 55 degrees at Bonnie View Bridge. And we understand that, but that's probably a little further down than relates to the spawning. And we'd like to continue to see how, and that may be an appropriate buffer. The other question, maybe it's a little bit too big a buffer. I'd like to be able to incorporate all of this. So we'd like to continue the discussion. It's not that I disagree with what they've said, and that's where we've kind of been in terms of a planning mode. And we just want to continue to have this discussion because and I'm all for the conservatism or the cautiousness about this, but it is rippling into some of the other parts of the operations, and we want to see if we can balance that as well. So
Yeah, not only that, but as you mentioned, you're doing salinity control goals as well in the balancing. Where is Bonnie View Bridge on the distance downstream? Is it about 10
Bonnie View
mile?
Bridge is roughly about the 10-mile mark. So a number of these historically for the last 3 years have been closer to Highway 44 Bridge, which is kind of halfway between Keswick and so about 5 to 6 miles upstream. So
you might be doubling the range of meeting temperature control?
we could be, and you know, it's
something.
probably
Because
appropriate.
distance is important too.
It's important, I think, well, there's a couple of dynamics. It's important that we don't know where the spawning is going to occur. One thing that we did do is we had a short period, because we were well encroached to Shasta, push out another 20,000 CFS for a couple days, hopefully to clean up some of the gravel. You heard some comments
That's
about
right,
that.
right.
Not quite sure if, that wasn't going to be the big, cleansing flow that it probably could be, but, it'd be interesting to see if spawning frees up a little bit further downstream. So that's the thing. The other part is this graph, in all fairness, is somewhat of a median spot. There's some variation potentially of air temperatures that can swing this a little bit. So this, frankly, if you looked at this graph, you said, this looks great. And what's the problem? The problem is that if you get a really hot summer in Reading, that line's going to creep up a little bit, and you're kind of bumping up to some of these reds that if they are a little bit further downstream, it's going to start eating into your success rate. So we want to be able to have the appropriate buffer. We've talked a lot about buffers as well. So this is where this is a work in progress. We've got a, particularly for the spring period, kind of define some releases at Keswick. They're, by some terms, they're cautious, just so we don't overshoot here. We're certainly trying to develop strategies. We don't want to start a cold water operation too soon, so we're trying to figure out what's the right trigger. Is it the very first red or carcass that you find in the river? Is that the time to start? or is that a time to start a discussion? Is it the time to start? So obviously from this, you can see spawning is fairly spread out. So um, that's a question, but that also brings into my earlier comment or the thought that early cold temperatures for the early spawners, they're probably your most successful spawners as well. Probably to take this, just to give you the snapshot as you pull away from this, here is a plot, if in focusing on the right side of the axis in CFS, the blue line has been our Keswick release through April here into the very first part of May, holding pretty close to 5,000 with just a little uptick here recently. The red line has been the flow on the Sacramento River at Wilkins Slough. And as you can see, earlier in April, pretty high, still riding the euphoria of those flows that we had back in March, but starts to drop. But even as late as last week, still 6,000 is, and we were still excess conditions in the Delta. Not a bad place. The dotted line is kind of the work that we've been doing because we continue to coordinate very closely with the Sac River settlement contractors as to what are your demands going to look like as you move forward. And they've held off thinking that, okay, April A was a time where we've had some concerns in the past. So they said we're going to start kind of middle of April, start to ramp up. And then this is kind of their typical pattern. But you can see over the last week, they've continued to gradually increase, but we started to see the drying out of the basin simultaneous with that. And lo and behold, by this weekend, we're down to 3,400 CFS, which is definitely a difficult time for a diversion operation standpoint. And we've been in, again, if you went back to years past, well, what's the operational response to this is we probably would have been much more upfront and said, gee, we need to put another 500,000 CFS into the river to maintain a buffer here. But given the concerns and where we're going with trying to manage these temperatures and make sure that we have absolutely all our tools left in the toolbox, we've been very cautious about going up to a monthly average 6,500 CFS. So now we're at a point where we're kind of adding after we see that the river is fairly low, and we're adding 500. That little blip up is 500 CFS. We'll probably add another 500 CFS here in a day or two, and reassess this again at the end of the week to see if it needs another 500 to accommodate that peak in diversion that we see here, which would take us to the 6,500, which was kind of in the overall planning process here for the spring. But we are trying to stick to that as close as possible and not kind of throw our 4.2 million acre feet around before we really need to.
Can you also talk about the difference between the exports between the two plans, the March plan and the April plan? What the differences are there?
In terms of exports, other than, and I can't really speak necessarily to the state project, but I think our exports are probably pretty close to the same. These diversions are probably consistent with, I think, the part of what we provide was some estimates of like monthly diversions as it relates to the Sac Valley. Now the April plan, in terms of temperatures, probably had focused on higher, let's say, Tama-Colusa Canal Authority water service north of Delta, which is the crossover a bit of timing of the contingency plan from the March, which didn't have the March flows increases, but our later March temperature plan did have that. So, but diversions in terms of ore and or pumping rates are pretty much the same in those, at least on the CVP side. And I'm pretty sure they're very similar on the state side.
And compared to last year?
Oh, gosh. Last year, and I know this painfully because I had to do a little presentation for some of our South of the Delta folks. This year, we're looking at probably, once we get into the July, August, September timeframe, and probably into the fall as well, is probably pretty close to our capacity at Jones Pumping Plant. Just given the releases we're talking about here, plus Folsom, plus other flows, and just basic flows within the system are still somewhat there.
And then the
Last year,
the diversions that are planned in the coming time frame, how does that look compared to last year? Because I know you've been working hard with the settlement contractors.
yeah, I think if I recall, and as it relates to probably this graph, probably where this is maybe in the early flood up in the 55 range, it was probably closer to 35 at this particular juncture. Probably a little more spread out early because we were trying to keep the peak down at this particular time. So this is a little more peaky.
Yeah,
in
and
that
a little
context.
more of a, what kind of a, would you say this is an average year type diversion scheme? That's
Probably as we get through the season, yes, if not just a little below. I think
yeah.
from what we've been able to do, and this is part of what we provide with the contingency plan, is Sac River Summit contractors roughly 1.6 to 1.7 million acre feet across their contract period. In a year where it's wetter like this, particularly with some wetter spring, later spring, probably closer to 1.5 million. Now, as an actual pattern, I think from a typical standpoint, they probably would have definitely had a little more April diversion here. This is a product of the wet fields in the March timeframe that's kind of bunched this a little bit.
About, I have no sense of time, whether it was a month ago or whatever, we had a room full of Sac Valley farmers who thought they weren't going to be able to divert until June. What happened? Because this
What
seems
happened
this does
since
seem
then?
very normal when we're still not sure that we have enough to be
Yeah.
conservative at the end of the year. So I just want to understand a little of the back and
Oh,
forth that happened, and I know I
yeah.
should just call Noah and find out.
Well, I do think when we had those concerns, I do think that it was kind of pre-March. We were
It was
probably,
that long ago?
I
Okay.
think it was, or at
March
least
18th.
I felt like it was somewhere in there.
It seems just like yesterday, but I think it had a lot of concern was, or just as we were getting into this, and we hadn't quite run this, right in the middle of when we were probably still halfway through those rains in the first part of March, I think is when we had this discussion. And that was being influenced a lot by thoughts from February. February being so dry, we were really at a very difficult spot where, again, we probably had better storage projected than the year before, but still, again, getting back to this discussion about getting up to the third row of shutters, we probably weren't there yet without, particularly at the end of February as a snapshot. So I think at that point, the question was, gee, if that's the case, we really need to keep potentially in the month of May, well, April 3250, and maybe run 3250 as a Keswick release through the entire month of May as well. And that would have, if you look at this graph, something like that, that would have definitely precluded much, if any, diversion off the river until probably the June timeframe, when you're actually trying to do some temperatures. So this is a kind of change over to the question of, okay, now we've had those March rains, 6,500 seems reasonable. Right now we're releasing water, and I didn't bring the graphic. I can bring it next time, where all the water we're releasing is going through the very upper shutters and skimming the very warmest water, which is adequate for the temperatures on the river, but we're not touching any of the lower level flows or quantities of water in the reservoir.
Right. Can you just, my apologies to folks who are waiting for the next item, go through, Rich talked about a lot of the stakeholder meetings and everything that was going on, but I have trouble. Where are you in stakeholder meetings? What's your meeting today with who?
Today is our kind of first kind of set ground rules, expectations with the Sac River Temperature Task Group.
And you've added, Rich said, but who have you added to that now?
Well, the only new group that we've contemplated or talked about is Sac River Settlement Contractors, and not them as a whole, come one, come all, but they're a representative or consultant that would provide information about their fishery activities and information they have, their trapping, their projects they're doing on the river, to be
Then-
able to help influence and give us an idea as to what's going on the river.
And where is this, and you had a big stakeholder, where's the stakeholder meeting that brings in the broader set of players, including some of the NGOs?
Yeah, we had one of those towards the beginning part of April. We had a very extensive invite list, talked about these issues, thoughts, concerns. Obviously, few of the themes had to do with flow stabilities, caution on temperatures, but a little less so. I think the March numbers kind of brought this more of a flow stability transition from winter run actions or management to fall run particularly. You know, the fishing industry is very interested in that dynamic.
And we are too.
And this is a type of year, if you're coming in the end of September with 2.8 million acre feet at Shasta, you're probably not as concerned about, oh my gosh, I have to hold up higher for dewatering winter run reds, but I really need to get low to be able to conserve water for next year potentially. This is less of a concern that way, so I think we've got some more flex that we're going to explore as to that timing. Again, it's the winter run spawning period and when that occurs that can make this a very difficult, tricky transition. But if it's more traditional, those winter run typically get out of their spawning gravel before you get a whole lot of the winter run coming up to spawn. So this is going to be one of those where the task group function is very important, is to get the intelligence of, okay, what are you seeing on the river with the fish coming upstream? So that was a big element. The other ones we did hear thoughts about, as it relates particularly to supplies for summer contractors, is will there be the potential for water available for rice decomp this year? And the availability of that to kind of help supplement waterfowl habitat.
And then when's the next time you'll meet with them? And what I'm trying to drive at, and I should probably just let's do a follow-up temperature conversation with staff just so that I'm not taking all the time here, is just to make sure that the decisions that you're working on, there's an opportunity both for the water user community and the NGO community to be in that conversation before you close on a plan. Because
I
otherwise it just pops up here, which is an inelegant place to have a conversation. That was a key part of our directive.
Yes, so not that we necessarily had that driven into the timeline, but I think we could certainly invite that same group back that we had the invite before. And given the benefit of our first temperature task group, basically present, here's where we're at. We've updated this with another set of forecasts, and a little bit closer to the time where we're getting close to setting the plan. We're actually going to start to the point where we're getting close to taking actions and get any final thoughts that they may have.
We also got a letter from the Pacific Fishery Management Council that I think Ron got a copy as well, and I've asked that we coordinate on the
Oh, good.
response to that.
No, I think we do need to do that, and that may be actually, once we've had a chance to talk about response to that, talking with that group about some of the questions that were brought up in the council's letter might be a good time. It may be a topic, or at least some of the themes we could talk through.
Right. I was going to ask, and I know Rich mentioned this, but now there's going to be the I can never get the names right, but the task force group, and then focusing on technical issues, and then moving discussions over to RT DOT where there are more policy discussions. And the main thing that I'm just concerned about, but it seems that you're headed in the right direction on this, especially if you have another stakeholder meeting where you bring in all of the stakeholders, is an opportunity to talk about trade-offs. And I know in Noah's email, Maria Ray talked about that as well. So the discussion, the more robust technical discussion about trade-offs is going to happen in that technical group. I'm just asking for confirmation so that you can try and sort these issues out. I mean, it's interesting because what initially sounds like maybe a reason to be concerned, once you walk through, then you've got outflow or maybe X2, but those discussions really need to take place in a technical group.
It's probably not to over add dimensions, but the task group, we really want to do, prime action number one is a data exchange. We have fishery personnel in the river. Tell us what you know. When, because as we just talked about, the spawning and the location, the timing is really critical to the
Right.
actions. And
Right.
having the best information about that is of the utmost importance. And then talking from reclamation's communication to those biologists about what we see in terms of cold water pool trends and temperature trends as we get partway through the season, and making adjustments to cooler temperatures or flow questions is the second point. Then we get past that, if what we identify is a particular course of action as it relates to the upper Sacramento River, we can kind of talk about that and say, gee, from the perspective of the task group, this is the way to go. This is the thing that we should do. But it has implications downstream. And at that point, we don't necessarily have the right people. So we've at least teed it up in that group. And there may be a policy question in there. This may be a technical, can you do something else someplace else? And there's a trade-off. Then we can at least take it to some of our other processes, which we typically have, and say, okay, what's the balance? If this means slightly warmer temperatures or a carryover change on the American River, let's get it to the right people that can balance that. Even within our biological community, they'll say, gee, I've got biologists that are very interested in the upper Sacramento, but Feather River operations or American River have their concerns. And I know when I meet with those groups in their components, they say, how come we don't have the stature, the status? And it's like, it's not that type of question, but it's certainly the precarious nature of the winter run that's utmost here. But we also want to know if we're making a change there and it has an effect on the American or the Feather, for example, what does that mean? And does that mean something with outflows? Does it mean management of the cold water pool, the other two reservoirs? It needs to be a little broader circle, and you can't have all those people in the temperature task group
Right.
for Sac River necessarily. So I'll say it's the balancing here is what's the right size of data exchange, information, discussions, and teeing up within the task group for the Sac River temperature task group, and what's the right place to then take these other things. Because it has been somewhat difficult because we've spent some time maybe inefficiently in the temperature task group on questions about delta operations or other parts of the system that, gee, let's just tee this up and then we'll take it to the right people. And then if it needs to come back to the task group, we can do that either via emails, telephone calls, you name it. We can figure it out. And that's been more traditionally where we've been, but as things have gotten so difficult the last 2 years, I think that that group's kind of grown, and now it's not a matter we want to shrink it, but we want to make sure that it's doing its function. And that's probably the long and short of that piece.
Then the other question that I had was on tools, improvement of tools. And it looks like, this model, this is a newer model, right, that with the rainbow?
It's a supplemental tool. I mean, we've done some work trying to, ferret out difficulties, shortcomings, what have you, with our temperature model we have been using.
Right.
And we have found some things that have made some changes. One of the areas, though, that we've supplemented with some of the work, particularly good work that No Fisheries has done is how do you take that, the thing that was never really very well integrated in or explored was the biology model, the model that tells you, gee, given these flows and temperatures, what's going to happen with that life stage of the fish. And I think the tools that No Fisheries is developing is kind of bridging that gap, particularly from the Keswick downstream. And that's where that kind of rainbow kind of is a distribution of a lot of that information in a spatial sense as well. So I think that that is an expansion of the tool set that kind of helps us. And I think that, but those are also very new. And we're trying to work through something as it relates to the temperature task group. How do we use that information with our information on the ground to make the best decisions that we can?
And then on monitoring, I know there have been some questions about monitoring, surveying, where are the fish, counting, what sort of improvements are being discussed on monitoring?
Well, I think that is an area where waders in the water is probably a key element, but also, how often, timing, kind of gets a little bit to personnel and funding questions. But I also think bringing in some of my hope is that bringing in the resources from the Sac River settlement contractors and what the work that they're doing kind of adds to that mix of the library of the monitoring that we have.
It's important for us to see how these tools play out.
That's
Did they
right.
work?
So,
And if there are questions about whether or not the model or the monitoring is robust enough, then we'll always have people on either side claiming that they worked, that the tools worked, or they didn't work.
well, I think that you could always have more monitoring, obviously, but this, where do you hit the limit with that? And that's an area where I think that if we can get the temperature task group set up with the right people, then if there are proposals to expand monitoring as things develop or situations present themselves, then we can, and if it's a funding question, we can figure out, well, who maybe has some funding or some resources to do something. We go through this a lot in the Delta where our limiting factor are boats and basically skippers. And can agencies kind of try to help each other out with that regard. And this is a similar thing, is who may have personnel that can help do particular components of things. Obviously, there's questions about rotary screw traps and, is it better to have so many more traps, less traps, all of that. We can get the biologists here to talk about those pros and cons, but I would like to see the temperature task group do that with folks that are really into it and may be able to present for policymakers what those pros and cons are. And that's a really good forum, I think, for that type of discussion. So if we can get into this is maybe a good year to try to get there, into a better flow of that type of information, data exchange, I think will be to everyone's advantage.
Flows are just critical to everything.
They are. If I could, I don't want to, I did want to say a couple things about San Joaquin River.
Sure, please do.
Because it relates to the change petition and the order. And we've been operating now, got about halfway through the post-flow period, have been hitting the releases on the Stanislaus Goodwin, making those releases, picking.
What was that?
Oh, no, it's good. We do want to hear about the pulse flow.
Start
That was
that
a
over
hard-fought agreement. So, yeah.
So we are making the releases,
Update
an
your,
observation has been that we've been hitting the flows as the releases. We've been picking up flows as we've gone along down in the Delta. We're right up against the OMAR targets that have been established for Delta smelt, but we've been working with Fish and Wildlife Service on maybe carving out a little more space there. So setting that aside, we'll work through that. But what we have been seeing is that the flows of Vernalis even though our releases have been kind of as we prescribed, have not been quite as robust as we would have liked to see. I think that's the condition of the dry basin. It could also be that as we increase the flows on the Stanislaus, water goes out into overbanks, and it's just kind of out there in storage, and when you release the flow, decrease the flows, you'll pick that up on the way down. There's probably an element of that. But we've been talking with the districts within the Stanislaus Basin and saying we really do need to hit the flows
Yeah.
that are in the order, notwithstanding the flows that we agreed to make at Goodwin. So we're in a process of defining them putting in some additional flow without necessarily needing to pick that up in the delta to hit the flow targets that we need to hit, particularly during the post-flow period. And get a better handle and be able to present to you guys the next time that's appropriate. Here are the flows that we're seeing come out of the Stanislaus. Here's the contribution that's kind of coming in just upstream. And I think what you'll see is graphically a fairly big number and a fairly small number. And we're making up some differences here at Vernalis, but give you kind of an accounting as to where we are as we get through at least the post-flow period. And then talk about, gee, what does that mean? We may have seen some increased inflows into New Maloney's, and this may keep us on the track, but we want to give you an update. But I think our first and foremost approach is to make sure we hit the May targets in terms of flows. And then if we need to talk about the summer and the fall and the carryover numbers, if that needs to move a little bit, then we can talk about where we think that is.
I agree.
But the flow
Gotta-
part, with our partners in the basin, we're committed to do what we can for across the period of April 1st to May 31st, that volume that was in the order, we're going to get there, and the shaping with the biologists will get through. But we definitely want to let you know that A, that's requiring some more water, but B, we're finding the water to make that happen.
Yeah, the last thing we want to do is lose those fish.
Well, that's certainly it, and I think as we go through, we're being very intense and trying to, again, monitoring on the Stanislaus River, monitoring at Mossdale to see where we're at, and as we put this water in. But the pulse period has been pretty key at time that we've had an iteration back out to the biologists of, gee, I think we're going to have to put some more water in from the Stanislaus side to this. Help us shape this new piece, this new increment, if that's what we have to do.
Well,
So
it sounds like it's a work in progress, but also included in the order was a direction that, I don't remember exactly how it was worded, but that you come back to us about future years, maybe a multi-year plan or something along those lines. So could you talk a little bit about going forward, how you see the Bureau's role in developing those recommendations and process?
well, that particular item is a somewhat tall order. It's to bring us something that creates peace in the valley for the next number of years. We're working with at least our Stanislaus stakeholders as to how we might approach that and try to figure out within the construct of the old San Joaquin River agreement and the San Joaquin River Group as to how might we structure something like that, because it's obvious that it needs to be a multi-basin type of approach, and to see what we can craft. Not quite. I don't have an answer yet. We've brainstormed about, gee, what might that look like, or how we go through a process. Like I said, we're trying to make sure we get the flows here through May that we need to get, and that's taking up a little bit of our bandwidth. But I don't know how it's going to play out, but we'll definitely have a proposal and some ideas as to how we get there. But it's probably trying to figure out how we get the right sized flows across the basin. Because as I said, the example that when we come back and report on where we are this year, in this particular May, what we're going to see is flows past Mace Road are not particularly robust. and certainly not the proportions that you would have expected in terms of given the amount of water coming in from the Stanislaus. So let me put this way, I don't think our approach will be how can the Stanislaus Basin alone be able to meet these objectives. I think it's going to be how do you what's the right and fair way to maybe do this, and we'll have some discussions amongst the stakeholders and the other basin entities as well as to what they think is coming down the road, particularly over, I'll say, a 5-year horizon.
Thank you very much for your time. A continuing conversation,
Like I
to
said,
be sure.
once a month's not enough. Come
No,
on.
it just isn't. Thanks
Thank
very
you for the
much.
time.
And then let's set a follow-up. Just all right. Moving towards item number 4. There'll be a drum roll involved. Oh, really? Is that what that was? Oh. Morning.
Board. Yelena Hartman.
Make sure the mic's on and pull it close.
Is it on? Okay. Yelena Hartman, Senior Scientist in the Office of Research Planning and Performance in the Climate Change and Conservation Group that's headed by Max Gomberg. Today we are providing a monthly update on the emergency water conservation regulation, focusing on the data reported for March 2016 and for recent enforcement activities. March 2016 is the 22nd month of water production data that were reported by the suppliers, and it is the 10th month with statewide urban conservation requirements that started in June 2015. And under the emergency conservation, suppliers were able to submit adjustments to their conservation standards, and those adjusted conservation standards took effect on March 1st, and they're reflected in the presentation today. And compliance is cumulative for the period from June 2015 through March 2016, and the Office of Enforcement continues to work with suppliers that have not quite been able to achieve their conservation standard. We typically look at weather conditions as cooler or wetter weather is associated with greater savings. And as 2013 is the baseline for our conservation regulation, we're using 2013 for temperature and precipitation comparisons. And map on the left shows for select cities average temperature in March 2013 in orange bars, and dark blue bars show the average temperature this year. And the map on the right shows precipitation comparison total for March in 2013 in orange bars and for March 2016 in blue bars. And statewide, March this year was cooler and wetter than in 2013. And as typical, there is regional variability. So we see, for example, that much of precipitation occurred in Northern California. And we also have places such as San Diego that was both warmer and drier than in March 2013. previous item provided a pretty nice summary of precipitation, and really if we look at the precipitation we have had in this current water year, so precipitation we received from October 2015 through the end of April, we see that Northern California is at around average. There are areas that are above average in blues and magentas, and there are pockets that are below average in orange. But what we also see here is that much of Southern California received below average precipitation, and areas in red are below half of average precipitation for the same period average. Division of Water Rights did a great job summarizing the condition of the snowpack, and this map shows two numbers for northern, central, and southern Sierra. The number of on the left is the percent of April 1st average, and as we expect moving through spring and towards summer, we are going down because April 1st is when the snowpack is typically at its maximum depth and water content. And what was already discussed is this number on the right, which is percent snow water equivalents for this date. And for this date, we are at only 61%. So we have seen a bit faster snowpack loss this year. And Southern Sierra is at less than half of what's average for this date. We also look at reservoir storage, and we typically highlight the 10 largest reservoirs in California as shown on Department of Water Resources Reservoir Storage Daily Summary, and Division of Water Rights already talked about this. I will just point out that looking at percent historic average, 6 of the 10 largest reservoirs are still below what they are on average this time of year. And looking at the percent capacity for these reservoirs, 3 of the largest 10 reservoirs are less than half of their capacity. So the snow melt and precipitation added to our storage, but there is still some areas with less water, and some of the reservoirs are still under flood operations obligations, so they may not be able to receive all the snow melt that might be coming in the period ahead. And finally, we have been looking at U.S. Drought Monitor for California as a metric of unmanaged water availability. And as of April 26th, U.S. Drought Monitor classifies 90% of the state as in drought, and 74% is classified as severe, extreme, or exceptional drought, which compares to 93% a year ago. So there has been substantial improvement, but still large areas of the state are experiencing drought, and we have not erased previous years of low water. With drought conditions in mind, Californians have really continued their high level of conservation we have seen since mandatory conservation started in June 2015. And when we look at statewide water production, the purple columns here show monthly percent reduction, and we see that in March 2016, Californians used 24.3% less water than in March 2013.
You might want to pause there for a moment of silent jubilation. It's pretty remarkable when you think about it after the rains. I mean, clearly, this says something about the lawn, because in the rain people know to turn off their sprinklers. But what kind of factors do you think led to this? I have my own theories, but I mean, this is the most welcome news we've had in a long time.
It is definitely great news, and undoubtedly the cooler and wetter weather contributed and made it easier to conserve. I believe that Californians also have a habit now and have adopted measures to conserve water and are more keenly aware of what they're using the water for. So while weather certainly helped, I believe this is also showing the commitment that California residents have for conservation.
Seems like it because it was also wet in December and January. So that, I mean, that was just the most welcome news in a long time, which hopefully does mean exactly what you said, that
And
folks get it.
I would add that spring is the time that you would take out your old lawn and put in a new one. I mean, it's a good time.
It would be a good time.
And so I suspect a lot of landscape firms are quite busy these days.
With that, really Californians, to reiterate the success, saved 35 billion gallons in March compared to the amount of water that was used in 2013. And with the water saved from June 2015 through February, we are at 23.9 cumulative savings.
Can we go back to it just for a minute, just because I'm trying to be consistent with some of the things we've talked about. Now, March traditionally is still not a giant water use month. So it's a tough month to save this much off. I mean, part of the challenge, I think the media has done a really good job with this. Sometimes people come in and are new to it and they don't quite get it, that our goal has never been to be 25% every month because Californians use half or more, urban Californians use half or more of their water outdoor on ornamental landscaping. And so we've been focusing on getting folks to recognize just how much particularly highly treated drinking water they've been using on their lawns that are beyond what the lawn needs to survive. And that certainly in a time of drought and in a time when there are communities running out of water and there are fields that are fallowed, using that pure drinking water to trick your lawn into thinking we're in Scotland when we're not is probably not the best use of a precious resource. And the polling seems to show that folks get that now. So hopefully it will stick. But I'm presuming that in March people historically tend to use more as an absolute amount than they do in February, or is February still a pretty low use month?
In March, it's still pretty low use, but it's more than it's used in February. In fact, the data that are presented in this item have been released today to the public, and in this presentation we do not show it, but some of the other material that's released today that's available on the conservation portal under conservation reporting tab has a graphic that shows monthly water production through the years, and we are showing 2013, 2014, 15, and this year. Maybe I actually added 2013. We don't have data for that. But those kinds of figures do show the annual variability in water production, and March is still one of the lower use months, so it's more difficult to save, but it is typically more use than in February or January.
So the real trick will be getting folks to hold the line as we move into the warmer, drier months. So it's sort of one of those things, if you don't love your lawn, you ought to lose it. And if you do love your lawn, you ought to keep it on a diet. Pretty much.
Statewide cumulative savings then, going back from June 2015 through March, amount to almost 1.3 million acre feet saved compared to the same period that was used in 2013, or this is 422 billion gallons. And just to put things into perspective, estimating that a family of 5 uses 1 acre foot of water per year, this is enough water saved to provide 6.5 million Californians with water for 1 year, or 17% of the state's population. So good progress. Suppliers also report on the residential use, and March 2016 was 66 residential gallons per capita per day, which is the second lowest since the mandatory conservation went into effect in June 2015. And this is statewide total residential per capita use, meaning both indoor and outdoor use. And it really reflects the conservation habits that the residents have developed. And it's also a result of actions that suppliers are taking, which Jasmine will cover in the next few slides. So handing it over to Jasmine.
Chair Marcus, members of the board, I have a brief update from the Office of Enforcement this morning. This chart shows the supplier enforcement actions taken between June and March. And March is the fourth month of distinguishing between rate penalties, the light green, which is tied to water usage over a certain water budget or allocation, versus other penalties, the dark green, which are fines from infractions of local ordinances for water waste. In general, we see complaints, warnings, and penalties starting to increase again. This trend will likely continue as weather gets warmer. Looking more closely at the rate penalty data, of the 58 suppliers reporting rate penalties in March, 74% showed improved cumulative savings compared to February. So that seems promising, and hopefully that'll continue in the warmer months, and we'll continue to track that. This chart shows a breakdown of suppliers by compliance priority. The significant change in priority breakdowns in March 2016 is due to the revised conservation standards that came into effect in March. Many standards were reduced, so there is a nice jump in the number of suppliers that met or were within 1% of their new conservation standards. That's the green bar. Of the 4 suppliers in priority 1 that is missing their standards by over 15%, 2 have conservation orders and 1 has an alternative compliance order. And we plan to follow up with each of these for continued compliance assistance and getting to know a little more about their status of their programs.
Does this graph include the 7 or so agencies that have alternative compliance standards?
It does. It does.
Yeah, doesn't excuse them from that, so it's a subset.
Still shown here, so.
Right. For the 11 suppliers with the conservation orders, 1 supplier is now meeting their new conservation standard. This is the city of Hemet, whose standard got reduced significantly. And 6 out of 11 show upward trends for cumulative savings. And the suppliers are missing their standards cumulatively by between 1 and 20%, or between 13 and about 300 million gallons, which has actually improved significantly since February with the reduced.
In part, I'm sorry to interrupt, are these in part because, I mean, some of them just had unusual circumstances that our tiers didn't necessarily work for, right? Like Livingston, where we would have shut down the main employer in town if we hadn't adjusted the standard, and we obviously didn't want to do that. But for others, they just got a slow start and some of them missed or that may be a different chart, some of them just missed the summer months and now are in gear.
Right, so Livingston actually has an alternative compliance order, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But many of these communities with the conservation orders are smaller communities, and some maybe didn't have a great conservation program to begin with. So when we met with them last summer, we outlined a few directives for them that we thought would help them achieve compliance, and many of them had rate studies as part of that. And with the Prop 218 requirements, many of them had a slower start to getting their rate increases in place. But we're hopeful that now that the warmer months are coming, the communities would see improved conservation with those price signals related to rate increases. So for the 7 that have alternative compliance orders. All the suppliers are meeting the directives of their orders. 3 suppliers are meeting their new conservation standards, and I just wanted to note that the alternative compliance orders do not substitute for individual conservation standards. However, suppliers meeting the terms of their orders, which in this case is all 7 right now, are not priorities for enforcement. So progress of these suppliers and the ones with conservation orders will continue to be tracked each month. And I just wanted to mention briefly the 4 with the administrative civil liability complaints that were issued last fall. So one of them has paid, and public comment period for 2 of them just ended. So work on their supplemental environmental projects, or SEPs, will officially commence this month likely. And an agreement with the last one should be reached soon, and then their documents will go into public comment. And then for next steps in terms of enforcement, the current strategy will be reevaluated pending upcoming potential changes to the emergency regulations, which Yelena will speak more to.
Thank you, Jasmine. So, right, the draft proposed regulatory language is under development, and the board adoption hearing for that is scheduled for May 18th. And if adopted, new conservation requirements from that would become effective on June 1st. And really, to wrap up this conservation update, really a reminder that Californians have risen to the occasion and have acquired habits and skills to conserve, and it's important to continue to do so, and also it's important to protect our trees, and information is at saveourwater.com/trees.
Thank you so much for that report. Excellent. Questions?
Real quick.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm real
please.
interested in the alternative compliance story, and to me, this has been in my opinion, a successful adjustment where we've recognized site-specific circumstances, as the chair has pointed out. It could be business related, it could be the swamp cooler issue and public health, and there are other examples. But as you pointed out, it continues to be counted as not meeting the standard. Could you answer the question about in our alternatives to do any further modifications to this standard later this month? Are we looking at ways to soften, the requirements for these entities where we've determined alternative compliance is appropriate based on these factors? Standard adjustments.
Right. So depending on how standards may change in the upcoming potential changes, we kind of look at whether the directives have been met, and a lot of them are, since they've been in place for a while, and a few of our folks with the alternative compliance orders have moved to a quarterly reporting cycle, as they've met some of the things that we've already discussed. So it's possible that we would revisit their orders, as well as the ones with the conservation orders, pending new changes. So.
Great work. All right, with that, we will take a 10-minute break and then reconvene. We're reconvening at well, it depends on which clock you look at, isn't it? Screen says 10:58 or 9. The back looks like it's 11:01, so close enough. I'm going to call it on time. And with that, we're going to move to item number 5, which I've really been looking forward to. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael.
Good morning. I'm Michael George. I'm the Delta Water Master. I'm pleased to be here, and I can see kind of the tops of your heads over your
I know. Wait, I can move my
screens and so
chair
forth.
up. But then it's uncomfortable.
This does feel a little bit like an inquisition, so we'll carry on.
That didn't
I'm pleased to be joined this morning by my colleague Lauren Barva, and Lauren gets full credit for doing a lot of the cataloging and management of the enormous amount of data developed from this program. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And I'm also pleased that in the audience today, among the hordes of people interested in this report, are two of the people who, along with the folks in my office, really crafted and negotiated the terms of this, George Hartman and Jennifer Spalletta. So this is a report on the voluntary diversion reduction program among in-delta riparians that took place during the 4 peak months of the growing season of 2015. So just a quick background, when this was conceived and began to be developed in April of 15, we were facing the 4th year of the drought. Curtailments of water rights were a serious threat. We just found that our snowpack was essentially 0, and the governor had extended the emergency drought proclamation. And in that context, representatives of farmers in the Central and South Delta proposed a voluntary program under which they would reduce their diversions as part of a process to try and reduce stress on the system. So the goal was exactly that, to reduce agricultural irrigation diversions, and we settled on a 25% versus 2013 baseline, which was roughly what the governor was asking for on the M&I side. And the state board agreed to forego deeper enforcement of deeper cuts to riparians if they should come later in the year. And as all things in the Delta, that was a little bit controversial, so we'll talk some about the impacts of that. But that's the background. The terms of the program were, first of all, that participation was entirely voluntary. So when we were putting the program together and when we announced the program, there was no certainty about who would sign up, how many would sign up, what the potential impacts would be. In addition, enrollment was offered solely to those who had made prior claims of riparian water rights. So we limited this to riparians, again, because among other reasons, riparian water rights are not transferable. So if we had reductions in diversions based on riparian rights, that would not give rise to transfers, which obviously were and continue to be a touchy subject. Participants were required to file specific plans for their specific farms as to how they would meet the objective of reducing their diversions by 25%. And they had to get those in a hurry. And that's one of the lessons learned. We were not smart enough. We didn't have enough foresight. Lauren hadn't joined the team at that point. So we got a lot of data in. And as you all know from prior interim reports, we spent a good deal of the time during the program trying to organize the data to understand what we had, because we got more than we anticipated. But more than the fact that we got more than we anticipated, we hadn't sufficiently thought through how we were going to manage that data. And that's one of the reasons that I'm grateful to Lauren for helping sort that out. We'll talk about that again as well. We kept the program extremely flexible because we wanted farmers to tell us how they could manage to meet those diversions. We wanted them to tell us what trade-offs they thought would make the most sense and provide the most benefit at the least cost. So we let them tell us what they were going to do, but we said two things. One is we'll be out there verifying whatever you do. And number two, at the end of this whole thing, we're going to ask you to give us an after-action report. Tell us how it worked. And in fact, we did get some reports during the process. We got people who said, I filed this plan in good faith, and it turns out that we can't do that, but here's our alternative. And I think there were 3 of those circumstances, all 3 of them who said during the program, we can't do what we said we do, we'll do this instead. All of them met the eventual target. The participation in the program was centered in the Central and South Delta. Why was that? Well, one is that in the North Delta they have a contract, so that there was not as much incentive there to operate to a lower diversion standard because from their perspective, they'd been paying an insurance policy all the way along, so that if their riparian or pre-1914 or other rights were out of priority or out of water, the Department of Water Resources was obligated to make stored water available to them. So the participation that we had was was heavily centered on the Central South Delta and parts of Contra Costa County. So we issued the report about which we're talking to you this morning on March 11th. We've captured a couple of points of errata. Grateful to the individuals who pointed out things. One individual said the spreadsheet that we had misidentified part of his plan, and then there was another discrepancy about actually the timing of when the majority of riparian rights were perfected, and so we made those changes since March 11th. The report, which is posted on our website, notes those minor changes. Turns out we had a total of 217 plans that were prepared, about 2/3 of the total acreage in the Central and South Delta. And according to the reports of the participants, they overachieved, 32% reduction. And I hasten to point out, as we do several points both in this presentation and in the report itself, that those are estimates, and the methodology for estimates are not reliable, and that's one of the reasons why your board adopted measurement regulations to implement SB 88. So we're going to have better measurement in the future, but it is important to note that the reported reduction is a report based on good faith estimates, and obviously do demonstrate significant effort within the Central and South Delta, which we verified through our inspections and also cross-verified with computer analysis of satellite imagery to demonstrate that there were significant reductions in the diversions. But the program was voluntary and very flexible, and it did bring out a great deal of creativity, which I think is one of the gifts that's going to keep on giving for us. We learned a lot through this program, and we've been able, particularly through a lot of the work that Lauren and her team have done, to consolidate that data, correlate it with other data that we've got, some from the information order, some from files, and so forth. So we really do have a much more robust set of data, particularly in the Central and South Delta. It appears, as you all remember, we came within a hair's breadth of needing to implement some kind of curtailment of riparian rights right at the end of July. And we missed having to do that by that hair's breadth. And when we flipped the calendar over to August, because of the supply-demand curves are monthly averaged, the reduction in demand in the system in August got us away from that need to curtail. So it's hard to say, but it is probable that some of the reduction in demand caused by this program allowed us to avoid that. And as we point out in the report, managing the riparian curtailments in the same watershed as you're managing appropriative curtailments is a conundrum that we have not figured out. And I am happy that that cup passed our lips and we didn't have to drink from it. I think another important part of this is that it does demonstrate the benefit of a voluntary program. We got people to come together to do things that met a common objective to reduce stress in a time of stress that we could not have put together on any kind of regulatory basis, and we would have set off, as often happens, litigation and so forth. We avoided that, and we basically addressed a common problem with solutions that came from the ground up rather than from the top down. We did that without anybody waiving their water rights, without any court involvement, and without having to regulate or curtail. So how did all this happen?
Sorry, can I interrupt real quick? So I appreciate that very much. I wonder though, and you can comment on this, but the fact that we had to, under the governor's executive order, implement the mandatory requirements, and the fact that folks were being held to certain standards under penalty of enforcement, did that have some kind of a ripple effect that strengthened the incentive to do something voluntary? Not so much as a fear of reprisal, but more out of, we're all in this together, our cousins in municipal and industrial have to measure up. We think we can do something, without having something required on us.
I think that was a big motivator. There was a clear sense within the Delta that it was inappropriate for them to take 100% allocations when everybody else was getting cut back so badly. So there was some motivation to do that. I will also say, however, that some of the representatives in the Delta felt like there was a virtual gun to our head. Yeah, it was a voluntary program, but you were down here telling us that we had we should have an expectation of curtailments. Now, those curtailments never happened, but no question at the time this program came together, we all, I think, anticipated that we would have to have riparian curtailments. And so, yes, people like Dante Namalini, the executive director of the Central Delta Water Agency, said, yeah, we're going along with this, but it's a gun to our head. I think the much more widespread sentiment was, we're all in this together, and it would be inappropriate for us in the Delta not to share some of the burden.
And did you get a sense over time that the North Delta folks might want to participate if there's some kind of sweetener, or I don't know what we could do, but
right. So
didn't
the frank answer to that is no. There was never any interest in the North Delta in participating in this program. Now, the North Delta will tell you, and I go to the North Delta meetings and water agency meetings and talk with them. There's no question that they did things to conserve water last year. They didn't participate in the program, in part because they felt like it would vitiate or reduce the insurance policy that they'd been paying premiums on since 1981. So they were interested in letting the water master know that they were doing things to conserve water, but they also wanted the water master to know that they didn't need his badge. So what happened? What did they do? We thought that a lot of people would fallow in order to meet the 25% reduction goal. There was actually a fairly small amount of fallowing that went on. There was some rotation to less water-intensive crops. A lot of people took the crop that they had in 2013 and planted something that would take less water. Um, I would say the biggest contribution to the savings was in alfalfa fields, where they reduced the frequency of irrigation. So if they irrigated in 2013 or on a normal schedule every 2 weeks, they did it every 4 weeks. That meant that they reduced the quality of their product and also the quantity. Um, and they did that very often. They said, we sacrificed some alfalfa in order to protect our tomatoes, because the tomatoes were a more valuable crop. They wanted to concentrate the water there. They took the hit on alfalfa. And the other thing they did was with corn, they stopped irrigating early. Instead of letting the corn mature to an international grain commodity, they cut the corn and turned it into silage. That had an unintended consequence of glutting the market for silage in the Delta, and collapsed the price of silage. Bad news if you were selling silage, pretty good news if you were a dairy farmer buying silage. But that was an unintended consequence. We got a lot more silage in the Delta last summer than people anticipated in May when they were making planting decisions. We also saw a lot of people who were taking advantage of the fact that they had made investments in irrigation techniques between 13 and 15. Now, those irrigation techniques were changed. They went to drip irrigation for yield purposes and other purposes, and they took advantage of that to come into our program. It was a real reduction in the diversion necessary to water the same crops because of the change in equipment. That wasn't caused by the program, but we credited it during the program. And then people reconfigured some fields. So I'll talk more about reconfiguration in a moment, but these are the headlines: 217 plans. I went the wrong way. There. These are the examples that I was expecting to see. So on the left side of the screen, that's different irrigation. People went to 60-inch instead of 30-inch beds. There were people who were thinking about doing that, but it was an experiment, and if they had plenty of water, they probably would have done it the same old way. But this turned out to be a pretty attractive way to reduce demand on the system. You could irrigate the entire field in about half the time, and you could save some significant evaporation before the water got to the root zone. Also on the right, safflower and Sudan grass, which were two of the crops that people turned to reduce the water demand. And then here I'm telling you a little bit about verification inspections, and you'll all recognize the real handsome guy on the right who accompanied me on this particular verification tour. And I can tell you that he left all the beans in the field. There was no takeaway here. There's no freebies from this. But this gives you an idea of what was going on. These are dry beans in a field that the year before supported tomatoes. So less water for a different crop. And this is a field from George Perry and Sons near Lathrop. And this is an inspection where they asked us to come out. They wanted us to see what they were doing and to understand its impact on their operation in terms of how they had managed. I think they were pretty proud, Steve, of how well they had managed to meet the 25% reduction goal and not to reduce very much their quality of their ultimate product and their farm gate value. Now, they have more flexibility because they do a lot of melons and pumpkins, things like that. So it's a later crop, and they could choose literally to have a little bit smaller pumpkins. But in any case, we learned a lot being out in the Delta, riding around with farmers, hearing what they had to say. We found that everybody was operating, Ron Milligan talked about operating to a buffer. Everybody tried to operate to a buffer, and that's one of the reasons I think we got to an overall 32% reported reduction. Some people missed it. Some people didn't achieve what they expected to achieve. But overall, it was a 32% reported reduction. And one of the reasons for that was not just that we were out in the field doing verification inspections. It's because there was a lot of peer review. People who were driving by their neighbors' fields, and they could tell whether people were meeting their objectives or not. And they also learned from each other through the course of that. And they took some pride in what they were doing to contribute to the program. So these are just a statistical overview of the number of acres and the reported reduction in diversion, and that disclaimer that all of this data is compiled from sources that are not measured. We'll do a much better job of measuring as we go forward in the rollout of SB 88 and its implementing regulations. So overall observations, the cooperative agreements produced results and reduced conflict in a time when we were all under a lot of stress. We never attempted to verify water rights, so these are all riparian claims. None of them were verified as a result of this program. We weren't trying to do adjudication of these rights. So all we did was make sure that everybody who participated in the program had previously filed a report with us claiming riparian rights. As I've already said, we narrowly avoided the curtailments. At one point in June, we identified what might have been an impact of this program, and I think, unfortunately, we'll probably ever know whether this had a positive impact on delta outflow, but it appeared in June that might have been the case. I'm grateful to the state water contractors that they've done some additional study of this. We just got a copy of a summary of some work that they've done over the weekend. We're not all the way into it, but we're looking at this in a lot of different ways. I think in addition to the work the state water contractors have done, Lauren and her team are correlating a lot of the information we got from this program with the 2-year consumptive use study that we're doing with UC Davis and Cal Poly and others. So we're trying to get a better handle on what this means for delta outflow. As you all know, there's a lot of discussion now about how that delta outflow index can be made better in light of our experience during the drought. We hope to contribute something to that. Over the long term, doing all the things that were done in the Delta, there is a concern among the farmers that it would cause some salting up of their land. So
had multiple dry years of doing it.
Exactly, and if they continued to reduce diversions like this, and every year they're concerned that there would be an exacerbation of the problem we already deal with in the Delta of salt built up, salt recirculation, and so forth. And I guess biggest takeaway would be this need for improved measurement of diversions, because we were working with estimates that weren't uniform. They weren't uniformly reliable. They had too big a margin of error. So even before this program got off, we had the Division of Water Rights and the Office of Delta Water Master. We'd met with the Central and South Delta to say that the measurement methods that they had used we deemed to be inadequate because they were inherently inaccurate. And we pledged to work with them to develop better strategies for that. Then along came SB 88. We decided to hold off. Let's see how that got implemented. But it's one of the reasons we had so much benefit from the outreach when we developed those regulations, because people were poised knowing that the way they'd done it in the past in the Delta was not adequate. And then the final point, I don't know how we would have managed a side-by-side cutback that is correlative for riparians and is by strict priority among appropriators. And I'm glad we didn't have to deal with that in 2015. And I hope that a miracle happens and somehow the legislature helps us figure out how we should administer between those two systems that are in inherent conflict. We've avoided that conflict for most of the time because we haven't had these continuous long-term shortages at the same time that we've had so much growing demand. That's kind of the future that we see for ourselves, so we better figure out how to manage this inherent conundrum in our system. So I think that's all I have to say, and be happy to answer your questions, and I'll refer most of them, I'm sure, to Lauren.
I can see George and Jennifer here, but
They have cards.
I'd like to get your impression of this. Had we had to go to curtailments, and you talked a little bit how farmers were using the flexibility of this system to focus on the crop that really needed the full allocation, like tomatoes, and making some adjustments on alfalfa or corn. But had we had to have gone to a curtailment, approximately at what point would that have been in the growing season? And then, you have a hammer. So if you could comment on that, the loss of flexibility.
Right. So when that would have happened, as I've said, was right near the end of July. So kind of midway through the 4 months of this program. We had agreed with respect to anybody who was in the program that if we'd had to go those deeper curtailments, not that it wouldn't have impacted them, because they could have been impacted obviously by shortages, physical shortages, unavailability of water. But we agreed that we wouldn't enforce against them. We wouldn't issue a CDO. We wouldn't issue an administrative civil liability. We wouldn't collect fines. So in a sense, by entering into this, the people who entered into it, and I think that's why we got most of the people who could be eligible for it, most of those people participated, roughly 2/3 of the total acreage. And the other third either hadn't prior claim to riparian rights or for another reason couldn't be involved. There was one farmer who had converted not to a less water intensive crop, but in 2015 he planted rice, fairly unusual in the Delta. Probably not great timing. So he wasn't successful in meeting his 25% goal. But had we had to do that curtailment, we had already seen through some of the litigation that had happened that we would have been challenged by people who said, I've got a riparian right that is earlier than some of the riparian patent dates. And so tell me, Mr. Watermaster or Division of Water Rights or State Board, how you're going to correlatively curtail him when I'm senior to him. Shouldn't he be cut off entirely? And then the riparian to say, well, come and ask me for a correlative sharing of the shortage, but I want to see you cut deeper into the priority system. I certainly did not see, and I had a lot of discussions with my colleagues in the Division of Water Rights and elsewhere, and I certainly did not feel that we had a plan for managing those two systems that would not have just tied us in our own knots and in the knots of a lot of litigation to come. So I'm glad we missed it. I'm glad we stared it in the face, and I hope we solve it before it comes again.
Okay, and then in light of the fact that it was missed, so, and I was talking with George about this earlier, and I'm sure he'll be sharing his thoughts on this, but I think the key take-home here is that this definitely worked, and maybe with some adjustments, how can we utilize this as a tool going forward, not just in that area, but as was mentioned, perhaps in the North Delta or in the tributaries. And just would like to get your thoughts on that, and as far as the future, how can we build on this, maybe have a template. I know this was very intensive in putting it together. Now it's been put together. So how can it be built on, take something off the shelf, make some adjustments, and really focus more on the messaging and getting folks to sign up. And as part of that, how do you deal with sort of the challenge that in light of the fact that the program was so successful and there was such broad participation, perhaps it averted the need for curtailment. And then what do you do in the next round where farmers may say, maybe I don't sign up because I'll let other folks carry the load for me. I didn't get the impression that folks were doing that in this last round, but perhaps there might be farmers that would consider that as an approach in the next round.
So to your last point, Dee Dee, I think there was a concern among those who signed up because nobody knew who all would sign up. There was a concern that there'd be free riders. It turned out, as it became more clear, as we were able to gather the data and start to report the data, it turned out that sense of maybe there are a lot of free riders seemed to dissipate over time. Everybody realized that no, everybody who could did participate. So that's the last point. But let me make kind of 3 points if I can remember them in response to the first part of your question. What can we take from here? Well, there are some physical things. I mean, the changes from flood irrigation to drip irrigation is the gift that'll keep on giving. That will reduce the demand for diversions, and that's aimed at improving yields and improving value of the product and so forth. And a lot of the tomato processing contractors are really helping to get that done. They want to make sure that they have reliable source. They want to improve the quality. And so they're pushing that. The farmers are participating. That's going to continue. Secondly, there clearly was some experimentation that got done last year that might not have gotten done without the impetus of this program. And some of that experimentation turned out to be pretty good. I think we're going to see more people go to these 60-inch rows because that turned out to be an effective and painless way to reduce diversion. And remember, when you reduce diversions in the Delta, you're reducing power costs because either you have to pump water out or you have to pump water in, and in a lot of places you have to do both. So a farmer who can figure out how to reduce the demand for water in the Delta saves money. It also helps with their precision agriculture to know exactly how much water is going and what kind of stress their plants can take. So we're going to get those advantages of just, I'll call it, farmers learning from their experimentation. And that'll be not just the people who did the experiments, but it'll be their neighbors who learn about it at the coffee shop or drive by it and understand it. I think that's going to continue. But finally, and probably most importantly, kind of two sides of this. On the one hand, I think it really empowered people in the Delta to think that they could get together and make something significant happen. The other side of that is the problem, among the problems that we have in this black box that is the Delta, is there's no institutional capability to organize the Delta. This came together because there was a very clear crisis. There was a very clear objective because George and Jennifer and others put together a simple program. And so what I'd like to build on is that sense of empowering farmers and water managers to figure out how to make things better. And there's no doubt that everybody in this system understands that if the environment doesn't get better, farming can't continue, it can't be profitable, it can't be sustainable. So there's a great deal of interest in helping the environment, and I think that's going to be a part of this. The challenge, in my view, and one of the challenges that we're focused on now, two parts of it. One is building institutional capability to make decisions and carry out programs that will make sense for all of us. And then secondly, figuring out how to start conversations about some compromises that are necessary without everybody immediately going to their assigned positions and sending, lobbing insults at each other. Um, uh, if we could figure out a way to have some of those negotiations take place off-screen so that the combatants could all disavow it, and yet have people start exploring some interest-based negotiations rather than positional negotiations. And frankly, I give enormous credit to people like George and Jennifer for being open to that kind of opportunity that this program created.
Was just going to make that same comment or compliment, it all started with some bean burritos. Actually, not just bean. There were all kinds of different fixings in the burritos, but yeah. So
Those burritos?
yeah, I think you had some too, right?
I've had those burritos.
Well, that
Magic burritos, obviously.
magic burritos. George continuing, not just with board members, but farmers that maybe they would have been adversaries at one point in time, or perhaps even continue to be adversaries, but figured out a way to just, as Michael said, just focus on this one aspect, and really provided for an opportunity to build relationships and continue the dialogue. So really want to thank George and Jennifer for all their work on it. And Michael, you and your team talk about building relationships. I mean, you could see it firsthand, and it helped. I think it paid off not just in this program, but as you went forward working with a different team on measuring and reporting on the stakeholder discussions. I could see that. I attended a couple, and I could see that it really helped to make a difference. So thank you. And your report is a good read.
Thank you. And I'd just say one thing as kind of echoing that, and it goes back to something, Tam, you said in a board meeting, that the most precious commodity in the water business is trust. So I'm hoping that this project that we all worked on, and that I think we all have a right to be proud of, if it created a little increment of trust, that's worth a lot.
Thank you, and I had a chance to be in the field as you documented in your presentation, and meet some folks and spend not nearly enough time, but learn so much in so little time. But it was exciting to see the learning happening, on the ground and the ownership of it. I'm interested in hearing the speakers clearly on insight into this, but in the spirit of the trust, we want to have the outcome a little more like others that have advanced in agricultural efficiency, such as Israel and places like that, where you're not penalized for doing the right thing, that somehow you haven't lost an advantage or flexibility or freedom by innovating. And when you look to trying to encourage the neighbors to the north to implement the 60-inch solutions for certain crops where it's appropriate and those kind of things, how do we structure things at the state level to show that you don't get penalized just because you've been efficient, and you don't have to answer that right now, but it feels like that's one of the key aspects of the use it or lose it, what I think is a myth, that you can still, with investment help from the state, you can still have every bit of agricultural economic success with not as much water, but with, the right set of tools. So, I want to encourage thoughts about how we can react to this type of information and setting forth, incentives for voluntary participation with measurable outcomes, because I think this can be a very strong partnership where everyone benefits, including the environment. So any thoughts, but also just to our partners in the Delta about, how can we, incentivize things when we want to see contracts like North Delta has, but not have them penalized for agricultural water efficiency advancement.
So I appreciate the fact that you're not asking me for a response on that, and I think that this is the challenge why you guys get the big bucks. This is the buck stops up there, not down here. But I will say that it seems clear to me, just as an observer, that there are too many fields, too many crops dependent on surface water irrigation, and they've gone to groundwater irrigation during this terrible drought, and we're going to have to accommodate that. So it seems to me that one of the best things that we could do collectively is to put up real goals and say, if we've got 9 million irrigated acres now, we see on the horizon a long enough time to plan that irrigated agriculture in California, to be sustainable, to be profitable, to provide food security and safety, it needs to get by on a less robust water allocation and give the farm community the opportunity and an incentive to plan toward that day. Because it's very difficult for any business to say, cut back on one of my key ingredients by 25% right now. And yet, I do think that farmers have demonstrated an ability to adapt. Not all of that adaptation is necessary, you know, at the individual level. It's not always positive. You know, I think we're probably going too far on the pendulum toward tree crops. That's not, you know, you don't talk food safety and security when you're talking, you know, almonds to China. Now, on the other hand, we can't penalize individual farmers who are making economically incentivized decisions about how to use their precious water commodity to get the best bang for the most crop per drop, or the most bang for the buck. So I think that is one of the big things that we all need to be thinking about. How do we say to the farm community what the future holds on a basis that allows them over time through their own devices to adjust to that future that I think we all see.
Well, why don't we turn to our speakers? Thank you. It's great. And Ms. Spalletta, do you want to just come up together and grab chairs? Because you've asked for 10 and 5 minutes respectively, or you can go to that. It's up to you, whatever you'd prefer.
My name is George Hartman. I'm an attorney in Stockton, California. I thought I knew where I was going to start until I listened, and now I don't. But there's one place I want to start. I want to echo something Mike George just said, and that's about Board Member Dodek. I attended a meeting maybe 2 years ago where you closed your remarks by saying, we have to build trust. And up to that point in my life, I've been loosely described as being anti-government. And I'm not a fan of top-down regulation. I'm more of a free market kind of guy, but I thought that was a striking comment. I'd never heard anything like that in a public meeting. And it was that really motivated me to change my way of thinking, which led to a lot of good things. And you need to get credit for that. So I wanted to give it to you. You reformed a sinner a little bit. I'm known to say things that aren't politically correct. I apologize. I think you all know that Jennifer and I, and we worked primarily with Board Member Diadamo. She is great. We worked early on with Chairperson Marcus. She's great. I mean, what we built out of this were incredible relationships. That's really the guts of it. And then Mike George came along and was an integral part of everything we did. Another great relationship. And we were all working on trust building. But to answer some points you made, Mr. Moore, which I thought were insightful. One was not. I think you had it a little bit wrong-headed. The question isn't how do we not penalize people for innovating. The question is, how do we incentivize them to innovate? I think that's something we have to focus on. And how you can incentivize people to do this. The other thing I would tell you is, it's the old Okie saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think that the deal we put together, it had to be assembled in a short frame of time, just like, let's see, it's May what now? If we're going to do it again this year, we better get cracking on it. I wouldn't tinker with it too much, really. I mean, people understood it, and I think the Water Master did a great job of thanking the participants. I've not heard any comments about free riders, none. But you don't know what happened before this program that led to this program. And it's important that you know, because you know, it's easy to sit there as regulators, as the top of the pyramid, and say, well, we can fix this by regulating. Well, maybe you can't. And maybe it's something that's best left to the participants to figure out how to share the common resource. I mean, you've got to be there to help, obviously, to help navigate through too many laws and regulations and to provide guidance when needed. But what preceded this program that, I'm sorry, Dee Dee, I should say Board Member Diadamo, but if I keep saying that, it takes too long, was a participant in, along with Felicia. There was an attempt made earlier in the year to put together a voluntary program as a demonstration project between farmers in the Delta and federally supplied farmers south of the Delta. And Dee Dee put me together with Dan Nelson, who was then running the San Luis Delta Mendota JPA. And we said, let's go for it. Let's try and do something. And the start of that was, we brought a bunch of the board members from the JPA to McDonald Island in the Delta. And we fed them camp burritos that both Felicia and Dee Dee have had a chance to enjoy, and you're all invited to come try them. That's what the workers on McDonald Island eat every day. Great food. So a bunch of these farmers came up. And, you know, they came up with a lot of suspicion about the Delta. They're stealing our water, those folks. Well, they got to McDonald Island, and they discovered, as in most cases throughout the deeper Delta, nobody's stealing anything. There's no place to store water. Our problem in the deeper Delta is not enough water, it's too much water that comes in by way of seepage and artesian flows. On McDonald Island, we pump 8 acre-feet per acre back into the system every year. We might divert 4 to 5 acre-feet per year. All that excess water has to get pumped back into the system, or it's lost to the system. So when the farmers came up and we toured them around the island, and then we had lunch, there was a pronounced transformational moment when our farmers in the Delta and the farmers south of the Delta decided, hey, we can work together, we can figure this thing out, and we put a program together for farmers on McDonald Island and other islands. Dennis Gardemeyer was a wonderful farmer leader in this whole thing. He really was the organizing effort, at least for the group of farmers in that, just like Jennifer was in the voluntary conservation program. But he got our group of farmers together, and this group of farmers and the farmers south of the Delta, they said, we'll do it. We're going to get it done. And so we agreed in the Delta to fallow ground. It was very simple. We would fallow ground. We wouldn't agree to transfer water. That wasn't our issue. We just agreed to fallow. And there was a payment involved. That's called an incentive. There was a payment involved to do it. And it was up to the agency to figure out how to transfer water liberated by not farming, for use for the federally supplied farmers. And they figured it out. It was all put together. And everybody signed off on it, including you folks. And then it got shot down. DWR wouldn't approve it because, as I understand it, Matt and Kern wouldn't approve it because they didn't think the pre-14 rights were sufficiently proven to substantiate a transfer. So it just got shot down. The good thing is that the relationships that came out of it led to the voluntary conservation program that Mike George is talking about, or reporting on here today. It was the relationships that were key. So my sense is, just like when you have kids who don't get along, you put them in a room and you say, work it out, and don't come out until it is worked out. That's kind of what the farmers did on their own in the first attempt at this. And they worked it out. They worked out a great idea. It would have worked terrifically. We assumed that we could save 3 acre-feet of water doing that per acre, but we based the payment on 1 acre-foot. And Dan Nelson and I did that in 10 minutes. It wasn't hard. And so I would encourage you to stick with what worked, not to try to fix it too much. Mike George is a great mediator and leader, and I think we were all pleased with the way he handled things. It was a breath of fresh air, so I would encourage you to do that. And then finally, I would say, if we're going to do it again, if you want this to be, I was going to talk about institutionalizing it, and I think you nailed that, Dee Dee. We need to make this an institutional possibility. And so, so we don't have to go through all the crud every time we want to do it. I think we can take what we have. I don't know if you're going to get everybody to sign up again. I really don't. It's unclear to me what the threat of curtailment is for this year. Everybody looks around and says, well, we had a really wet winter. Well, we did. And so does that mean we need 4 months of a voluntary program? Maybe 3 months would be enough. But I think the farmers learned a lot this last go round. I think they learned they can make it. But they have to have enough warning to plan for it. I have one client who signed up. She followed her ground. She had wanted to maybe plant safflower for cattle feed, but it was a little too late to do that. So I'm out of time. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. If not, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer.
Well, I really just want to thank you both. I think for me, this is one of the bright spots of the drought and something that I talk about a lot when I'm in other parts of the state. It's not so much for the courage and the creativity that you all showed. I'm encouraged to even try and figure out how to work with us and do something different is not the norm. And I know not without some cost as you tread into the across the sacred ground of senior water rights. And I think the brilliance of this, there was a great bullet that Michael had about being able to figure out how to solve a problem without having to litigate water rights or not having to rehash the arguments that have been ever thus, or the rhetorical badminton that we see all the time on these issues, but trying to figure out how to solve a problem. I particularly found your statements when you did it. There's a pragmatism to it, of course, in terms of what might have happened, but also just understanding that narrative of why in the worst drought in modern history, urban areas were taking a 25% cut for their own security, not to give it to anybody else. And when you did have junior water rights holders with fallowed fields and communities running out of water, that you wanted to be a part of stepping up as Californians. And that just meant the world to me and is a story that I think is about the better angels of our natures, but also a path forward. So it was really inspiring, and it was, I have to say, a great story to tell in other parts of California who find the dialogue around water rights, if they know what it is at all, mysterious and inexplicable in the 21st century. So thank you for just
Thank you.
calling on your humanity in all of this.
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind. But to add a punctuation mark to what you just said, I had a professor from the University of Tasmania fly over 25 hours of flying from Tasmania just to talk to me after we did this to find out how in the world it happened. How could you do this? And by the way, he told me there are still Tasmanian devils, but they've moved them onto another island to avoid Tasmanian devil plague. So they have their own sanctuary. I know you find that fascinating. But anyway, it was that there was a German television crew that came over. You know, they were fascinated by, why would people do this? And the answer, that's why I talked about the first effort out of the gate, when we got the southern farmers and the northern farmers together. They did it. We didn't do it. They wanted to solve the problem, farmer helping farmer. And that was a beautiful thing. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks. It's sort of the opposite of the water knife.
Pardon me?
Sorry, just a sci-fi book reference.
Oh.
See if we can get Paolo B., can't pronounce his last name, to write a different alternative scenario for the future.
Thank you. Okay.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to provide some comments. And I just want to echo what George explained, that this was a good experience, I think, for me personally, and for my clients who are the ones who asked me to ask you if this would be possible. And some of what you didn't see, and even Mr. George didn't see, about this program, I wanted to tell you. There are, for example, on Roberts Island, more than 100 individual parcels, but there's only about 15 farmers. So when some of my clients who farm parcels owned by other people had to sit down and think about how they were going to do this program, they weren't just thinking about how to reduce diversions by 25%. They were thinking about which ones of their landlords were not going to get paid rent this year. And a lot of those landlords are people in their 70s or 80s who rely on the rent check from their 20, 40, 100-acre parcel as their only source of income. And so there was a lot of work that went into spreading the pain of cutting back crops, having reduced cuttings of alfalfa, not doing a second crop of cucumbers, or choosing which parcels to fallow. And so I know that there are some people who outside of the Delta think that the description of how good this program was may be a little too generous because we didn't actually measure exactly how much was diverted in 2013 and how much was diverted in 2015. But I can tell you from spending very, very long hours with all of my growers who participated that they took the requirements of the program very seriously, and that they did divert less water, that they kept track of it, because if you run the same pump for 24 hours versus running it for 12 hours and it's a single speed pump, you divert half as much water. And so we did those kinds of record keeping. I told them all to keep good records because you all would probably come and want to look at them, and they did. So I think there was a lot of validation, at least that I saw in the program, and I'm very proud of my clients and their colleagues for stepping up and putting a lot of time and effort into something that I think made a difference. I also want to thank the executive director, Tom Howard. When we met the first time, I think there was one moment where we kind of looked each other in the eye and had the realization that even if this program only did half of what it attempted to do, it would still be a major benefit for the system during a time period when we needed it. And there was something to be said for putting your swords at the door and actually rolling up your sleeves and getting something done. And I think we collectively, those of us who usually work on these issues and are fighting about the nuances, liked the idea of rolling up our sleeves and getting something done. and it was very gratifying for everyone who participated all along the different levels of the program. I also want to put a thank you out there to Central Delta and South Delta. I personally only worked on about 50 of these plans, but there were, I believe, more than 200 that were submitted. The vast majority of the legwork in assisting individual landowners in putting their plans together and doing the requisite reporting was done by the representatives and the staff of those two agencies. And so there actually are institutions in the Delta who can achieve a lot, and they do achieve a lot. And something that we tend to forget is that measurement and reporting in the Delta has only been occurring for about 6 years. You know, there was previously not a requirement that it be done. And so there's been a real change in how a very large group of people have had to keep track and report to you on their water use. And those agencies are instrumental in making sure that those people understand the requirement and fulfill it. So I do want to say thank you to those agencies. If it wasn't for them, this program would not have been anywhere near as successful as it was. Lastly, I know that there are many in the export community who question whether the program was successful as far as achieving what they would like to see as far as reduced water use in the Delta, whether it actually made a difference in Delta flow or salinity issues and made operations easier for them for the projects. I frankly have the same questions. And that's one of the things that I like about the results of this program is that it has put in my mind a whole list of questions that I would love to explore and love to answer. Because if this program is not giving the projects some relief or making the system work better, we should know that. And we should collectively, the stakeholders, the water users, we should collectively be doing the research and the communication, frankly, that hasn't been occurring, should be occurring so that we learn more about each other's needs and we learn more about the tools available to evaluate the success of these kind of programs, and we can tailor them over time. It's ridiculous to think that we could come up with the perfect program in a couple months and have everyone be happy. But we did something, we learned a lot, and I think we have an even larger list of things we'd like to keep learning. And I frankly look forward to the opportunity to keep working with the other stakeholders and start checking things off on that list and say, we met, we battled it out over a conference table, we shared our experts' information, we learned what we agree on and what we don't agree on and where we need to do more research, and we've crossed one bridge and let's jump on the next one. So I'm motivated to have those conversations and to keep going. So I hope this program is a launching point for that.
Next we have Terry Erlewine from the State Water Contractors.
Hi, thank you. Appreciate the chance to talk. Really appreciate Jennifer's closing comments because that's pretty much where I'm at. We sent in comments. Basically, the state water contractors looked at this program as really a positive development, and it's really great to see, you know, what is seems to clearly be a very good a good faith effort by nearly all the participants to make some progress. And I, like others, I agree that this is really the way to move forward, is to have voluntary programs and collaborate. So I think that's all very positive. We did send a letter into Michael indicating some of the things we observed. And one of them is related to diversions, and just reiterating what Michael said, that I think it was, you know, you can look at the glass as half empty or half full. I think we're looking at it more as half empty. But on the diversions, that most of the diversions, the reported reduction is computation, which I recognize is probably about all you could do. But I think it's really a good thing that we have measurement regulations that are in place now. So if this program is repeated in the future, that won't be an issue. So that was just one observation we had. And then the other observation we had was we did do some analysis to look at what the effect of the diversion reduction program was on consumptive use and depletions, and consumptive use and depletions are ultimately the basis for a water transfer program. And the data is fairly noisy. It's hard to make, absolute conclusions. But what it did look like was that there was the flows on Old and Middle River, which are downstream of where most of this diversion reduction program was, in South Delta primarily, but a little bit in Central Delta, that those flows were kind of in the same ballpark as they've been in prior years. And if you'd had a true 25% reduction in depletions, which is not really what we expected, but if you'd had a 25% reduction in depletions, you would have expected a bigger effect on the flows, which you didn't see. I would just state that that's really intended to be the beginning of a dialogue like Jennifer referred to, that we need to be real about this and identify what our real concerns are and identify what we're really going to be looking at. And this is just opening of a dialogue as far as I see it. And I wanted to make sure that we don't look at this and say, hey, this problem's solved, let's just move on. There's still work to be done. So that was the letter that we sent, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
You've identified the comments that the folks in the Delta have made is that it is more complicated than one for one. That's the burrito conversation on McDonald Island. So hopefully going forward, I appreciate what you've said. You'll join in the continuing conversation, because clearly for us what ends up happening is folks lob assertions into the middle of a room about each other, whereas frankly, as I think was laid out earlier, people sitting down and talking with each other is more likely, not necessarily to resolve everything in one big happy family, but to identify where the issues really are versus that oblique across the transom kind of dialogue, which frankly is an enormous percentage of what we hear in this room and isn't where we make the best progress. So I appreciate that opening to want to get into those conversations.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll just say that from a water rights perspective, the focus is diversions. But from a let's try and figure out what to do with this situation perspective, we all have to look at the big picture: diversions, consumptive use, seepage, pumping, all the whole gamut.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges,
understand.
that your tool is diversions, but what you're really, in a lot of cases, what you're really seeking is consumptive use, and it does make it a challenge. So,
Thank you.
All right. That was great. Thank you all, and thank all those other institutions and people who engaged. That was progress amidst the gridlock. With that, next, I guess we can move on to item number 5. 6? Sorry, I didn't put my glasses back on. 6, board member report.
Since I'm going to have to scoot out of here real quick, I'll go first. I really am reporting only on one thing. I met with. Bye.
I think so.
Thank you. Max Gomberg and I met with the developer of the water energy tool that the California Public Utilities Commission is using, and they're looking at some upgrades for it in the future. They're talking to the CPUC about that right now. One of which would be to document the GHG reductions that come from cold water use, not just hot water use. And marrying that with the award that was just given by OEMA here at the Water Board to, it was the number 2 award to UC Davis for their data work that found in the period last summer, I think of July to September, that the energy saved from the water conservation program was greater than what was being spent by the CPUC on energy conservation directly. And so I think we may have inadvertently had an experiment, a giant experiment, because there was no water being shifted around. You know, the argument that people mostly make about cold water savings, that if it's not used here, it'll be used there. Well, it didn't. I mean, there just wasn't water to be used, and so the cold water conservation did create energy savings, and my guess is it also created GHG savings. So I'm looking forward to seeing that developed even further.
Let me tag on to that. I had the honor of serving as one of the judges for OEMA's Data Innovation Challenge, and it came in second place, but very, very close second place. And first place went to a partnership that was put together by Orange County to look at stormwater data and how to use stormwater data in a more meaningful way, because that has a more direct linkage to our core responsibility that just slightly edged out the UC Davis project. But nonetheless, thank you for bringing it up. And I want to do a shout out to OEMA, Greg Gerhardt, and his entire staff. The entire Data Dive initiative has been a huge, I think, success in terms of just sharing with our stakeholder data that we are collecting and where we hope to go, what we hope to do with that data in a collaborative manner. So huge shout out to OEMA for that effort. And then I just want to report quickly, attended the Central Valley Regional Water Board meeting in Fresno, where they did adopt their own version of the Human Right to Water resolution, very much mirrored based on ours. They also, at the same meeting, adopted a renewed permit for Sac Regional. I'm sure you'll remember the last time they did that. This time there was actually no one there to comment. I know that C-SPOT did provide some comments in writing, but it seemed to be a pretty low-keyed adoption of this new permit by the Regional Water Board. Also at the meeting, I just want to give you all a heads up, Regional Board staff discussed in general principle a proposed general order that they'll be releasing later this month for poultry facilities. It's going to be interesting. It's based on a risk-based approach. So there was a slight bit of discussion about what we'll be discussing tomorrow with respect to low threat and high threat tiers for general orders may be applicable or not to this new order that is being developed by regional board staff. So that's one that I'll be watching, and I think we might be hearing more about that one.
Thank you. Great update. I'll just report on one thing. Yesterday, so May 2nd, I was a speaker at the ribbon cutting ceremony for a cooperative venture. It was led by Napa Sanitation District, but much of the recycled water infrastructure that was built is with partnerships with the County of Napa, but also the North Bay Water Reuse Authority, which is a multi-agency water and wastewater and county, 3 counties involved in this effort to coordinate especially recycled water infrastructure around the North Bay. So it's an institutional example of cooperation and worth noting, and just was honored to be there, and with Congressman Mike Thompson, Mayor Jill Teckle, Supervisor Keith Caldwell, and the head of the Los Carneros Water District, John Stewart. These folks have been working tirelessly to get these difficult projects through. We've helped. We've provided both SRF funding. Our staff, Dan Newton, has been exemplary in being responsive, and got a lot of compliments at this occasion. So there's the SRF part, there's the Prop 1 part. They got federal funding through Bureau of Reclamation, Title 16, water recycling funding, about 25%. Had to work hard going to Washington for this. And then on top of it all, a very strong matching local share with Measure A funds and individual landowners assessing themselves through community service districts to help make up the local match for about 45 million plus in improvements at the treatment plant, 2 pipelines that are 5 and 9 miles long. So it seems modest in some ways compared to some of the large projects we hear about, and yet it's significant in this area. It's going to solve some groundwater sustainability issues that have a Sigma flavor to it, using recycled water in an area near downtown Napa called MST. And it's solving water shortage problems for irrigation of vineyards in the Los Carneros area. So it's just a system that's working, but it takes a great deal of effort and coordination among many jurisdictions. So, I was there as a cheerleader, reminding them of our support of water recycling as part of the Water Action Plan. But we've got great examples throughout the state. Napa and their neighbors are a shining example of water sustainability planning and implementation.
Speaking of Napa, I was going to say, speaking of shout-outs, so just wanted to give a shout-out to DWQ staff and on the work that they have been doing on wetlands. So I attended, and I believe Board Member Dodick, maybe others, also attended some of the meetings last week, and I just felt like there was it was time well spent from the last time we had our briefings on this issue. I was very concerned. It was about a year and a half ago, and I think staff took to heart some of the comments and did a very good job. The stakeholder discussions were overall very positive and constructive, and there's going to be another meeting. I think the last meeting is with the ag stakeholders this week, and I'll be attending that. And then also just kind of looking at it from that perspective, taking the time to have some good one-on-one discussions with stakeholders. I think maybe that needs to happen on that winery general order. And Board Member Dodick mentioned this the last time we were together. And so I'll be spending some time with Board Member Dodick following up on this with Mr. Howard, and had a conversation with Region 5 about it. So I think a little more work needs to be done before moving forward on that. But if we sort of model it after, the wetlands format, I think that it'll produce some good results.
Great. I just a couple of things. One is something that just listening to you all reminded me of today. Yesterday I was at this you may know this group, Leadership California. It's a women's leadership group where they bring in classes of women to do a year-long, not an internship, but they go to events with a lot of corporate and public sector women leaders. And I was one of their speakers last night, and as I have so often, I was just struck by different qualities of leadership. And I was talking about this board and how amazing you all are in terms of being problem solvers, and in terms of seeing your role as opening the doors and the windows and helping the team and the staff be a part of that broader public policy making that's not from afar, but really grounded in trying to solve problems. So just reminded me how honored I am to be a part of this particular board. The other thing I wanted to mention is just, been doing a fair amount of speaking, a lot of reading, and starting to really dive in, along with all of you, back into the Bay Delta, which is where we need to be, and have been distracted necessarily by the drought. But I did work with staff on a presentation to our budget committee in the assembly that wasn't just talking about our budget, but was a spotlight on drinking water, We talked about drinking water, we talked about Flint, we talked about the lead and copper rule and all of that. And so just that it was good that the budget committee, rather than just looking at the numbers, wanted to understand some of the bigger picture and worked hard with staff. They worked very hard to try and put it together to do that update. So I know you're all very engaged in drinking water, but if you want another update on where we seem to be, because there's a lot we need to do on lead and copper, not just because EPA is going to redo their rules, but we're going to relook at ours and go faster than they will rather than waiting for them, because although we're not Flint, we have issues of our own, obviously, that we're working on. The lead and copper rule is not the most sturdy and let you sleep at night kind of a rule, and we can definitely do better because any lead anywhere is a problem. We're fortunate to be a younger state so that we don't have our entire system plumbed with lead pipe, and San Francisco, the biggest of the old cities, has retooled, but there are still issues. So we'll be working on that and coming up with proposals on that, on schools, a number of other things. So watch that space. It's really important. So with that, I will recess until tomorrow's workshop.